I am Dwayne Rollins, a 68-year-old black man who spent 4 decades hauling freight so my family could live like royalty. Last Saturday, at an extravagant corporate gala celebrating his promotion, my son shoved a clipboard into my chest. With his wealthy wife smirking beside him, he demanded I sign voluntary disownment papers, calling me a parasite in front of 90 elite guests. I did not yell. I simply picked up my pen, signed away my parental rights, and watched as my lawyer stepped out of the shadows to deliver a single piece of paper that instantly vaporized my son's entire empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogance always comes with a devastating price. The lively jazz quartet stopped playing so abruptly that the silence ringing through the lavish Atlanta ballroom felt suffocating. The cheerful clinking of champagne flutes against expensive crystal faded into an uncomfortable, heavy tension that blanketed the room. 90 elite corporate guests, the absolute pinnacle of the city's logistics and real estate society, turned their heads in unison toward the grand, sweeping staircase. I stood at the bottom step, holding a simple glass of sparkling water entirely out of place in my worn brown tweed jacket and scuffed work boots. I could feel the piercing stares of strangers dissecting my appearance, wondering why an old black man with calloused hands was standing in the center of their pristine high society celebration. The air grew thick with anticipation, thick enough that I could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning above us. The luxurious scent of expensive perfumes and catered delicacies suddenly felt cloying and oppressive. Every eye was fixed on me, waiting for a reaction, but I remained perfectly still, letting the heavy silence stretch out as the true orchestrator of this public spectacle prepared to make his grand entrance. My son Jordan descended the marble staircase with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He wore an obscenely expensive bespoke navy suit, the kind of garment designed to project absolute authority. Beside him walked his wife Megan. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed and her lips were curled into a sharp, calculating smirk that practically radiated malice. Jordan did not hold a microphone to address his guests. Instead, he gripped a thick legal document secured to a heavy leather clipboard. He marched directly toward me, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor, echoing like a judge striking a gavel. He shoved the clipboard forcefully against my chest. I caught it purely out of instinct. "The charade ends tonight," he announced, projecting his voice so that every executive and investor in the room could hear his cruelty. "Megan and I are completely done subsidizing your life. I just secured the vice president title, and we are moving into a new echelon of society that has no room for dead weight." Megan stepped forward, raising her chin. "You live in our guest house, rent-free, eat our food, and contribute absolutely nothing. Sign them, Parasite." Those words hung in the air, a cruel verdict delivered without a trial. I looked down at my hands. They were rough-scarred and permanently stained with the faint shadow of engine grease. These were the hands that gripped the freezing steering wheels of 18-wheelers driving massive freight loads through brutal Midwestern ice storms for 40 consecutive years. I sacrificed my own health, my sleep, and my youth specifically so Jordan could attend the most prestigious private academies in Georgia and never have to lift anything heavier than a fountain pen. I did not yell. I did not demand respect or try to remind him of the decades of backbreaking labor that paved the very floor he was standing on. Arguing with sheer arrogance only serves to entertain a crowd hungry for drama. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my tweed jacket and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. I uncapped it with an eerie, methodical calmness that seemed to unsettle the guests standing closest to us. "Are you absolutely certain this is the path you wish to take, Jordan?" I asked. My voice was completely steady, entirely devoid of the panicked humiliation they so desperately wanted to extract from me. Jordan clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with irritation at my lack of submission. "Sign the papers," he demanded harshly. "Stop pretending you have any sort of power in this house." I pressed the silver nib to the thick paper and signed my full legal name with deliberate precision. I capped the pen, handed the heavy clipboard back to him, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Do not regret this." Megan let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly across the ballroom. "We will certainly not regret shedding a burden," she sneered loudly. "Security will escort you back to the guest house immediately. You are to remain there out of sight until this party concludes, and you have 30 days to vacate the premises entirely." I did not move toward the exit. I simply adjusted my jacket, turned my gaze toward the dark arched doorway at the back of the room, and spoke clearly. "Bradley, proceed." Bradley Pierce stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. He was not a party guest, but a senior corporate attorney carrying a slim black briefcase. He walked briskly to the center of the room, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Jordan frowned, his arrogant posture faltering for the first time. Mr. Pierce Jordan asked, clearly confused. You are the general counsel for the corporate board. What are you doing here? I am attending a private function at the express request of my employer, Bradley replied smoothly. He opened his briefcase and produced a single document bearing a certified corporate seal. Jordan, you just forced your father to sign a document severing all financial and legal ties between the two of you. Yes, Jordan snapped, holding up the clipboard like a trophy. He is officially removed from my estate and my finances. You do not own this estate, Bradley stated with absolute authority. The deed to this property, the vehicles you drive, and 60% of the company you work for are solely owned by the Vanguard Holding Trust. Dwayne Rollins is the sole proprietor. You just legally surrendered your entire inheritance and your job. The color drained entirely from Jordan's face as the reality of the situation crushed the air from his lungs. The 90 elite guests who had just witnessed a son attempt to execute his father socially now watched that son's entire fabricated empire collapse into dust. Jordan dropped the clipboard, the heavy thud ringing out as he desperately began begging, claiming the eviction was just a mistake fueled by stress. I ignored his pathetic apologies and turned to walk away, leaving him humiliated in front of his peers. However, Megan's initial shock rapidly twisted into pure, unadulterated malice. She realized instantly that her lavish lifestyle was evaporating. As I took my first steps toward the grand foyer to exit the estate, the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut. 4 heavily armed private security guards mercenaries Megan had hired specifically for the evening stepped forward to block all available exits. The polite corporate gathering instantly transformed into a hostile trap, and I realized Megan was not going to let me leave the property with my power intact. Megan's face contorted into a mask of pure malice as Bradley's words echoed in the tense ballroom. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and screamed for the private security contractors she had hired for the evening. "Grab him!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "My father-in-law is having a severe dementia episode. He is not in his right mind." Before Bradley could intervene with legal threats, 4 heavily armed guards lunged forward. They did not treat me like the owner of the estate. They treated me like a dangerous intruder. Rough hands grabbed my shoulders, twisting my arms behind my back with unnecessary force. Jordan stood frozen, watching in cowardly silence as his wife orchestrated my capture. The guards dragged me away from the stunned crowd of corporate elites, hauling me down the long, opulent hallway toward the basement. They shoved me brutally down the stairs and thrust me into the estate's massive soundproof wine cellar. The heavy, reinforced steel door slammed shut behind me. I heard the unmistakable chilling beep of the electronic keypad engaging from the outside. I was entirely sealed in total darkness, a prisoner inside my own home. I did not panic as the pitch-black silence of the cellar swallowed me whole. Panic clouds the mind, and I needed my mind sharp. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, climate-controlled air fill my lungs and allowed my eyes to adjust to the total absence of light. Megan and Jordan believed they had trapped an old, confused man in an inescapable vault. What those 2 arrogant fools completely failed to realize was that I knew every single inch of this property better than the architects who drew the blueprints. 20 years ago, when my logistics company finally secured its first major national contract, I bought this exact plot of land for my late wife, Miriam. She always wanted a home with a sprawling garden and a proper wine cellar. Because I never fully trusted contractors, I personally oversaw the installation of the electrical wiring for the entire foundation. I routed the cables, tested the breakers, and installed the backup generators with my own 2 hands. I knew the exact layout of the security grids coursing through the walls. They had locked me inside a highly advanced electronic cage, but they forgot they were dealing with the man who built it. I reached into the deep pocket of my tweed jacket and pulled out my old trusty folding pocket knife. It was a simple tool I had carried since my days hauling freight across state lines, a habit I never broke even after becoming a millionaire. Moving slowly by touch, I navigated past racks of vintage wine bottles until my calloused hands found the interior maintenance panel of the electronic door lock. Next to a wooden wine crate, my fingers brushed against a heavy metal corkscrew left behind by a careless servant. It was exactly the leverage I needed. I wedged the corkscrew into the narrow seam of the steel panel, applying steady, relentless pressure. The dull ache of arthritis flared in my knuckles, a bitter reminder of my 68 years, but I ignored the pain entirely. I pried the metal plate loose until it popped off with a muted clatter. Using the blade of my pocket knife, I carefully stripped the rubber casing from the primary power wires exposed in the dark cavity. With the raw copper wires exposed, I took a deliberate, measured breath. I knew exactly which circuits fed the localized grid and which ones connected to the master breaker. I crossed the positive and negative wires, intentionally forcing a massive power surge back into the main system. A sharp crackle of blue sparks illuminated the dark cellar for a split second, followed immediately by the heavy, satisfying sound of the estate main breaker tripping. The entire mansion plunged into absolute darkness. The electronic locking mechanism on the heavy cellar door gave a weak mechanical click and disengaged. I pushed the door open and slipped quietly into the basement hallway. Above me, I could hear the immediate chaos erupting in the ballroom. The 90 elite guests were murmuring in confusion while the private security guards shouted panicked orders at each other in the pitch-black corridors, completely disoriented by the sudden blackout. I moved with the silent, practiced stealth of a man who spent his youth navigating unlit loading docks. I bypassed the main stairwell, choosing a narrow servant corridor that led directly up to the residential wing, entirely unseen by the frantic guards searching the wrong areas. I needed to exit through the back gardens to avoid the front gate security perimeter. To do so, I had to pass through Jordan's private study. I navigated the dark room by memory, stepping carefully over plush rugs and avoiding heavy oak furniture. As I moved toward the glass patio doors, my thigh bumped against the edge of his massive mahogany desk. The sudden movement knocked a plastic wastebasket over. A partially shredded folder spilled onto the floor, scattering strips of paper across the expensive carpet. Normally, I would have ignored it and kept moving, but a narrow beam of moonlight pierced through the glass doors, illuminating a specific corporate logo on one of the torn pages. It was the crest of the central bank holding the Apex Logistics Employee Pension Fund. I knelt down, ignoring the stiffness in my knees, and gathered the thickest intact fragments. I held the torn bank statement up to the moonlight, squinting to read the printed numbers. The figures were massive, terrifyingly precise, and completely unauthorized. I pieced together the destination routing numbers and the source accounts, and my blood ran ice cold as the horrifying truth materialized in my hands. The torn statement revealed a reality far more sinister than a spoiled son trying to evict his father. Jordan did not just want me out of the house to impress his elitist wife. My son had completely emptied the company $12 million employee pension fund. He had stolen the life savings of the drivers, warehouse workers, and mechanics who had loyally built our logistics empire from the ground up. If the federal auditors discovered this missing money before the end of the quarter, the company would be seized and hundreds of innocent families would be ruined. Jordan was trying to have me committed to a psychiatric ward tonight, specifically to prevent me from accessing the corporate ledgers and discovering his crime. I shoved the shredded evidence deep into my jacket pocket, pushed open the patio doors, and escaped into the humid Atlanta night. I was no longer just fighting for my own dignity. I was holding the absolute evidence of a massive federal crime, and I had to stop my son before he destroyed everything. I navigated the shadows of the sprawling estate grounds until I reached the dense tree line outlining the property. From there, I walked 3 miles in the humid night air to a grim neon-lit 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of Atlanta. The flickering diner sign cast a harsh red glow over the empty parking lot. Bradley was already waiting in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, nursing a cup of black coffee. I slid into the booth across from him, ignoring the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. Without a single word of greeting, I reached into my jacket pocket and dropped the partially shredded bank statement onto the sticky laminate table. Bradley leaned forward, his professional composure faltering as he pieced the torn strips together under the dim fluorescent light. The color completely drained from his face when he read the final routing numbers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound and terrifying realization. Jordan had not merely stolen from the family trust. He had deliberately siphoned $12 million directly from the primary employee pension fund, leaving the accounts entirely barren right before the end of the fiscal quarter. The sheer magnitude of the theft created an impossible legal dilemma that threatened to destroy everything I had built over the last 4 decades. Bradley rubbed his temples, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper as he explained the devastating reality of corporate law. If I officially stepped out of the shadows and legally reclaimed my public title as Chief Executive Officer tomorrow morning, I would automatically inherit the immediate legal liability for the missing funds. The moment the Securities and Exchange Commission detected the massive discrepancy during the impending quarterly federal audit, they would ruthlessly freeze every single operational account tied to Vanguard Holding Trust. The company would be paralyzed instantly. Our massive fleet of freight trucks would be grounded and the supply chain would collapse within days. But the most horrifying consequence was the human cost. 400 innocent warehouse workers, drivers, and mechanics would instantly lose their life savings, their health insurance, and their entire financial safety nets. Jordan had effectively strapped a bomb to the foundation of the business, calculating that I would never risk exposing his federal crime if it meant completely destroying the livelihood of my own workforce. He had weaponized my deepest loyalty to my employees against me, cornering me in a trap of his own greedy design. I stared into my cold coffee, my mind drifting back to the faces of those hardworking men and women. I vividly remembered the darkest year of my life when my beautiful wife Miriam was slowly dying of cancer. During those agonizing months, I could barely function, let alone manage a rapidly growing logistics empire. It was those very warehouse workers who stepped up volunteering for unpaid overtime and running the loading docks flawlessly so I could sit by Miriam hospital bed until her final breath. They had carried me through my deepest grief without ever asking for a dime in return. I absolutely refused to let those loyal families go bankrupt because of my son and his wicked wife. I looked at Bradley with steely determination. I told him I would quietly replace the entire $12 million using my own secret offshore emergency reserves before the federal auditors arrived next week. I would plug the massive financial hole silently, saving the workers before I publicly dismantled Jordan. Executing a covert international wire transfer of that magnitude required extreme security measures that could not be bypassed remotely. To authorize the release of the hidden offshore funds, I desperately needed my physical biometric security key. It was a specialized encrypted drive I kept locked safely away inside a private safety deposit box at my primary bank in downtown Atlanta. Time was rapidly slipping away, and I knew Jordan would be scrambling to locate me once his guards discovered the empty wine cellar. I stood up from the sticky diner table, tossing a $5 bill onto the counter for the coffee I never drank. I instructed Bradley to begin quietly drafting the necessary injunctions to separate the holding trust from the pension accounts, preparing for the moment I finally secured the replacement funds. The sky outside was just beginning to turn a bruised, hazy purple as dawn approached. I left the diner and caught a city bus heading straight toward the financial district. I needed to beat the morning rush, secure the biometric drive, and wire the $12 million before Jordan realized his perfectly orchestrated embezzlement scheme was unraveling right under his expensive leather shoes. I felt a surge of adrenaline pushing past my fatigue as I rode in silence. The early morning air was thick with humidity as I finally approached the towering glass facade of the downtown bank. The main lobby was still closed to the public, so I walked over to the secure exterior automated teller machines to withdraw enough cash to pay for a private car service. I slid my personal debit card into the machine and entered my PIN, expecting a routine transaction. Instead, the screen flashed a harsh red warning stating the card was declined and the account was completely locked. I tried a secondary credit card, but the machine instantly swallowed it, displaying a message instructing me to contact my financial institution immediately. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Bradley, his voice frantic and breathless. He had just received an emergency alert through the court filing system. Jordan and Megan had not wasted a single second during the night. They had rushed to a corrupt private judge and executed a fraudulent emergency psychiatric power of attorney. By legally declaring me a severe danger to myself due to fabricated dementia, Jordan had successfully frozen absolutely every single one of my personal domestic bank accounts. I was completely cut off from my own wealth, stranded on the city streets without a single dollar to my name. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of this legal strike, the screech of heavy tires echoed through the empty morning street. A stark white, unmarked transport van violently jumped the curb and slammed to a halt directly outside the bank plaza, blocking my only path to the main road. The heavy sliding doors of the van flew open with a harsh metal clatter. 3 burly men dressed in crisp white medical uniforms stepped out onto the pavement. They did not look like nurses or caretakers. They looked like hired thugs, and one of them was holding thick canvas straps attached to a heavy-duty medical straitjacket. Jordan had not just frozen my assets to stop me from replacing the stolen pension funds. He had tracked my location through the declined bank cards and sent a team of private orderlies to physically abduct me. He intended to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward, stripping away my voice and my freedom to silence me forever before the sun even fully rose over Atlanta. The orderlies did not hesitate. They lunged forward with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency, cornering me against the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby. The largest of the 3 men raised the canvas straitjacket, his eyes dead and focused, ready to wrestle me to the pavement. They expected an uncoordinated, frail old man who would crumble under their weight. They completely forgot they were trying to subdue a man who spent 40 years loading and unloading multi-ton freight shipments by hand. I planted my boots firmly on the concrete, accessing muscle memory built from decades of grueling physical labor. As the lead orderly rushed me, I grabbed the heavy brass base of a velvet rope stanchion positioned near the entrance. With a sharp, explosive burst of strength, I swung the 50-pound metal pole directly into their path. The solid brass base slammed into the knees of the first 2 men, sending them crashing hard onto the pavement with shouts of pain. I did not wait for the 3rd man to draw a weapon or pull a sedative syringe. I spun around and bolted straight into the building. I sprinted past the shocked security guard inside the vestibule and slammed my shoulder against the emergency release bar of the bank rear fire exit. The heavy metal door flew open, spilling me out into a chaotic, bustling alleyway filled with early morning delivery trucks and sanitation workers. The deafening blare of the fire alarm echoed behind me as I weaved rapidly between idling delivery vans, my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs. I kept my head down, pulling the collar of my tweed jacket up to shield my face from any security cameras mounted on the brick walls. I heard the distant, angry shouts of the orderlies recovering from the blow, pushing their way into the alley to hunt me down. I ducked behind a massive commercial dumpster, catching my breath in the humid morning air. I reached into my pocket to call Bradley for a vehicle extraction, but my hand froze. A cold, absolute realization washed over me. Jordan had tracked my exact coordinates to this specific bank almost instantly. They were not merely following my physical trail. They were actively tracking the GPS signal embedded inside my personal smartphone. If I kept the device on me, I would lead the psychiatric orderlies straight to my next destination. I pulled the expensive smartphone from my pocket, staring at the glowing screen that served as a digital leash tying me to my son. Without a second thought, I placed the device on the concrete, raised the heel of my heavy work boot, and crushed it. I snapped the shattered casing in half to ensure the battery was completely severed from the motherboard, then tossed the broken pieces deep into the foul-smelling dumpster. I was now entirely untraceable, but I was also utterly cut off from my legal counsel and my financial network. I slipped out of the alley and walked 6 blocks to a rundown gas station. I used a handful of loose change I found in my jacket pocket to access a rusted payphone. I dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. I called Rufus, a fiercely loyal veteran truck driver who had worked for my logistics company since its inception. Rufus was a man whose daughter I had secretly put through a private university when he could not afford the tuition, a debt of gratitude he swore he would repay. Less than 20 minutes later, a massive unmarked 18-wheeler rumbled into the gas station parking lot. The air brakes hissed loudly as the passenger door swung open. I climbed into the elevated cabin and quickly crawled back into the hidden sleeper compartment behind the seats, pulling the privacy curtains shut just as a police cruiser slowly drove past the station. Rufus steered the heavy rig back onto the interstate, blending seamlessly into the morning commercial traffic. As the diesel engine roared, Rufus began to speak, his voice thick with repressed anger. He explained that over the past 8 months, Jordan had been treating the veteran drivers like absolute dirt. My son had systematically slashed their overtime pay, canceled their union-mandated health benefits, and threatened to fire anyone who complained about the unsafe, overloaded freight schedules. The men were terrified of losing their livelihoods. I sat in the cramped sleeper cab, a heavy knot forming in my stomach. I realized the rot in my company was far deeper and more destructive than I had originally anticipated. Jordan was not just destroying my legacy. He was aggressively dismantling the safety and dignity of the working-class families who depended on Vanguard Trust. I knew I desperately needed untraceable cash to fight back higher off-the-grid transportation and pay Bradley the retainer required to wage a shadow war against my own son. Since my legitimate bank accounts were completely frozen by the fraudulent psychiatric order, I had to rely on a contingency plan. I remembered a secret stash of emergency cash and bearer bonds my late wife Miriam had hidden years ago. She secured those funds inside a private, heavily reinforced locker at an elitist all-white country club in the northern suburbs. It was a highly exclusive membership that Megan had forced Jordan to purchase simply to elevate her social status among the wealthy elite. Miriam despised the blatant prejudice of the establishment, so she maliciously used their impenetrable security vaults to hide our untaxed emergency reserves, knowing no one would ever suspect a black family of storing wealth in a place that actively tried to keep them out. The country club was a fortress of privilege guarded by high-tech surveillance and strict dress codes. Walking through the front door as an uninvited elderly black man would trigger an immediate police response from the snobbish management. I needed a flawless disguise to breach their perimeter and access Miriam's hidden fortune. I asked Rufus to pull the rig over behind a commercial laundry supply warehouse. Rufus reached into his duffel bag and handed me a pristine white button-down catering uniform and a black bow tie he kept for his second job working weekend banquets. I stripped off my torn tweed jacket and slipped into the crisp uniform, transforming myself from a hunted millionaire into an invisible service worker. I prepared to infiltrate the hyper-secure country club, fully aware of the massive risk I was taking. If Megan's snobbish socialite friends recognized me, or if the club security guards caught me tampering with the private vaults, they would not hesitate to call the police immediately. Jordan orderlies would be waiting for me at the precinct with a straitjacket. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, and walked toward the gated entrance of the most hostile environment in the city, ready to steal back my own money. The battle for my empire was no longer fought in boardrooms. It was being fought in the shadows. I approached the heavily guarded service entrance of the Oakmont Country Club with my head bowed and my posture perfectly submissive. The crisp white catering uniform Rufus gave me fit tightly across my broad shoulders, but it provided the exact camouflage I needed to bypass the extensive security perimeter. I grabbed a silver tray lined with empty champagne crystal flutes from a staging cart near the loading dock and blended seamlessly into a line of rushing waiters. Walking through the opulent, brightly lit grand ballroom felt like stepping into a completely different universe. I navigated the labyrinth of wealthy, oblivious patrons who looked right through me. To these elite socialites and corporate executives, an older black man wearing a service uniform was practically invisible. They laughed loudly, clinking their glasses and discussing their stock portfolios, entirely unaware that the man serving their drinks was currently fighting a shadow war for a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the patterned carpet, moving with silent precision toward the restricted corridors located at the back of the massive clubhouse. I needed to reach the women elite private locker room before the shift manager noticed a missing tray. I slipped silently past the heavy mahogany doors of the restricted wing and stepped into the lavishly decorated private locker room. The air inside smelled of expensive floral perfumes and polished cedar wood. I moved quickly down the aisles until I found the specific brass nameplate bearing Megan's maiden name. My late wife Miriam had brilliantly secured this exact vault years ago, knowing the sheer exclusivity of this establishment would make it the ultimate blind spot. I set the silver tray aside and reached into my pocket, pulling out a sturdy steel hairpin and a miniature mechanical wrench I had borrowed from Rufus' toolbox. Decades of repairing delicate truck engine components had left my hands incredibly steady despite the constant ache of arthritis. I wedged the tension wrench into the bottom of the brass keyhole and used the pin to carefully manipulate the internal tumblers. Within 40 seconds, the heavy lock yielded with a satisfying mechanical click. I swung the door open and immediately pressed my fingers against the false wooden bottom panel Miriam had custom ordered. I applied pressure to the hidden latch and the floor of the vault popped open. Resting perfectly inside the dark cavity was a heavy, dense velvet bag, completely filled with bundles of untraceable high-denomination cash. I securely fastened the heavy velvet bag to the inside of my catering belt and prepared to close the hidden compartment. Just as my hand touched the brass door, the sharp click of high heels echoed aggressively from the marble hallway outside. I immediately recognized the harsh, rhythmic cadence of Megan's footsteps. She was not alone. A heavy, authoritative male voice was speaking with her in hushed, urgent tones. I quickly shut the vault, secured the lock, and ducked quietly behind a towering row of oversized mahogany lockers positioned at the far end of the room. I pressed my back flat against the cool, polished wood, holding my breath as the main doors swung wide open. Megan marched into the locker room alongside her father, Gregory. Gregory was a notoriously corrupt local politician who wielded his political influence like a blunt weapon across the entire city of Atlanta. Seeing him standing here confirmed my absolute darkest suspicions. This vicious betrayal extended far beyond my son's foolish corporate greed. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, listening intently to every word echoing off the marble floors. Gregory paced the room, his voice brimming with arrogant satisfaction. He told Megan that the $12 million stolen from the employee pension fund had been successfully routed through 3 different international banks. The money was now sitting completely untraceable inside his private offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. He praised Megan for manipulating Jordan so easily, calling my son a useful idiot who handed them the keys to a kingdom he did not deserve. But the theft of the pension fund was merely the first phase of their master plan. Gregory explained the next step with chilling precision. They were actively orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover of my entire logistics empire. Once Jordan's fraudulent medical injunction successfully labeled me legally insane and permanently incompetent, Gregory planned to use his political connections to force the corporate board to liquidate Vanguard Holding Trust entirely. He intended to buy the massive freight company for pennies on the dollar, completely wiping out my legacy and leaving Jordan to take the ultimate fall for the missing pension money. My son was being set up for absolute ruin, and the woman he married was the lead architect of his destruction. I clenched my jaw, the reality of their pure wickedness causing my heart to beat aggressively against my ribs. As I slowly shifted my weight to get a better view of their position, the thick toe of my heavy work boot accidentally brushed against the edge of a long brass shoehorn left carelessly on the floor. The solid metal object tumbled over the polished tiles, the sharp clattering sound ringing out like a literal gunshot in the quiet locker room. Gregory stopped talking instantly. Megan whipped her head around, her calculating blue eyes locking directly onto my position in the deep shadows. She stared at me quickly, taking in my white catering uniform and the velvet bag bulging beneath my jacket. Any normal person caught verbally orchestrating a massive federal crime would have immediately panicked. Megan did not panic. A wicked, terrifying smile spread slowly across her face as her mind calculated a flawless, malicious pivot. Without breaking eye contact with me, she grabbed the heavy, expensive pearl necklace tightly wrapped around her own throat. She forcefully yanked the jewelry down, snapping the delicate silk wire and sending dozens of expensive pearls scattering violently across the marble floor. Then she opened her mouth and let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream that pierced the thick walls of the elite clubhouse. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. 4 massive private security guards charged into the locker room, drawing their batons. They saw a tall black man in a service uniform standing near the scattered pearls and did not ask a single question. 2 guards lunged forward, hitting me with the full force of their bodies and violently tackling me to the hard marble floor. I hit the ground heavily, the breath knocked completely out of my lungs as they pinned my arms behind my back. Megan collapsed against her father's chest, sobbing with incredibly convincing fake tears. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "That deranged old man just attacked me in the dark," she cried out to the horrified guards. "He grabbed my neck and tried to steal my jewelry. Please get him away from me." One of the guards drove his knee into my spine, securing heavy plastic zip ties around my wrists. I could already hear the distinct, terrifying wail of approaching police sirens echoing loudly in the distance, speeding rapidly towards the country club to seal my fate. I sat handcuffed to a heavy steel table in the center of a freezing police interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed with an irritating mechanical hum. The stainless steel cuffs dug sharply into my bruised wrists. My tweed jacket was torn at the shoulder, a souvenir from the private security guards who had pinned me to the marble floor of the country club locker room just an hour ago. I did not shiver. I did not rub my wrists or look around frantically like a guilty man. I simply stared at the blank gray wall ahead of me, breathing slowly to maintain my focus. The heavy metal door swung open with a violent metallic clatter. The lead detective marched into the room carrying a thick file folder. He slammed a freshly printed document onto the table right in front of me. It was a formal sworn victim statement entirely fabricated by Megan. The paper detailed a horrific, entirely fictional account of how a deranged, senile old man had ambushed her in the dark, violently choked her, and attempted to rip a priceless pearl necklace directly from her throat. I remained completely stoic. The detective leaned heavily over the table, placing both hands flat on the cold steel surface to intimidate me. He began to aggressively berate me, treating me exactly like a confused, desperate criminal who had wandered into a wealthy neighborhood looking for an easy score. He raised his voice, demanding to know what kind of drugs I was on and threatening to lock me in a state psychiatric facility for the rest of my miserable life if I did not sign a full confession immediately. He told me that people like me did not belong at the country club and that my mind was clearly rotting away. I let him yell. I let him expend his energy while I quietly scanned the brass name badge pinned to the breast pocket of his uniform. The engraved letters read, "Detective Thomas Miller." A very specific memory immediately surfaced in my mind. 30 years ago, long before Vanguard Holding Trust became a massive logistics empire, I was just starting to turn a real profit. I remembered a hard-working local mechanic named Arthur Miller who fixed my early freight trucks. Arthur was about to lose his family auto shop to a ruthless bank foreclosure. I secretly paid off the entire mortgage for him, saving his family from absolute ruin. I waited for the detective to finish his aggressive tirade. I looked up and met his angry gaze directly. I asked him if his father was Arthur Miller, the man who used to run the small independent auto repair shop over on West Side Avenue. The detective stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I calmly stated the exact date in October 1994, when a cashier check for $42,000 arrived anonymously at the commercial bank to clear his father completely of his business debt. I mentioned the specific custom blue paint job on the sign that hung above his father's garage door. Detective Miller froze entirely. The aggressive posture vanished from his shoulders as all the color drained from his face. He stared at me in stunned silence as the realization hit him. He suddenly understood that the handcuffed, supposedly senile man sitting before him was the legendary silent benefactor his father had spoken of with deep reverence for 3 decades. The power dynamic in the freezing interrogation room shifted instantly. Detective Miller swallowed hard, looking quickly over his shoulder at the small red recording light blinking on the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He walked over to the wall panel, flipped a concealed switch, and discreetly turned off both the video and audio recording feeds. The room was now completely off the record. He turned back to me, his voice trembling slightly with newfound respect, and asked me what was really going on. I explained the entire situation with absolute clarity. I told him about my son stealing the employee pension funds, the fraudulent medical injunction designed to declare me legally insane, and the corrupt politician Gregory orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover. I explained that Megan had cornered me in the locker room and maliciously staged the assault. I instructed Miller to stop wasting time interrogating me and to immediately review the raw security camera footage from the restricted hallway outside the country club locker room. I told him the cameras would unequivocally prove that Megan was never attacked, that no struggle occurred, and that she aggressively tore her own pearl necklace off her neck to stage a fake crime scene before the guards ever arrived. Miller did not hesitate or argue. He pulled his mobile radio from his belt and quietly requested the dispatch unit to patch him directly through to the country club security hub. He ordered a trusted junior officer on the scene to bypass the club management and personally review the unedited video files from the specific hallway corridor. We sat in silence for 10 grueling minutes until the radio crackled to life. The junior officer confirmed everything I had said. The high-definition footage clearly showed Megan standing alone just inside the doorway, looking directly at the camera with a wicked smile before violently ripping the pearls from her own throat and beginning to scream. The fabricated assault was officially exposed. Miller unlocked my handcuffs, immediately apologizing profusely for the rough treatment. He knew Megan lawyers and her corrupt father were already swarming the front lobby of the police precinct, demanding my immediate transfer to a psychiatric ward. To bypass them entirely, Miller led me down a restricted maintenance corridor toward the back alley exit. Before opening the heavy metal door to let me out into the night, he handed me the heavy velvet bag filled with the untraceable cash they had confiscated upon my arrest. I thanked Miller for honoring his father's legacy and stepped out into the cool, dark alleyway. I found a secure payphone 2 blocks away from the precinct and immediately dialed Bradley. I ordered my lawyer to start following the specific offshore money trail Gregory had boasted about in the locker room. I told him we needed to find out exactly where that stolen $12 million was being funneled right now. I hung up and waited in the shadows. Less than 5 minutes later, the payphone rang. Bradley's voice on the other end was high-pitched and completely panicked. He told me the money was not just sitting idly in an offshore account. Gregory had rapidly wired a massive portion of it to pay off a brutal, highly dangerous real estate syndicate that Jordan had somehow gotten involved with. Bradley warned me that the payment was significantly short, because Jordan failed to deliver the full amount. The armed syndicate enforcers were heading directly to my main logistics warehouse tonight to collect the rest of their debt in blood. I directed my driver to bypass the main highway and take the industrial service road straight to the primary Vanguard Logistics compound. We arrived under the heavy cover of absolute darkness. The sprawling facility usually hummed with the steady rhythm of overnight freight loading, but tonight, an unnatural silence hung over the yard. The heavy steel front gates were completely smashed open, their reinforced hinges twisted and broken. 3 matte black sports utility vehicles were parked aggressively at slanted angles directly across the primary loading bays, deliberately blocking any trucks from entering or exiting the facility. I stepped out of the car into the damp night air. The sharp scent of spilled diesel and fear permeated the loading dock. These men did not care about corporate structures or legal injunctions. They operated strictly on violence and immediate returns. They had come to collect the remainder of the massive debt my son had foolishly acquired, and they were willing to destroy my entire life work to send a message. I walked steadily toward the glowing fluorescent lights of the open warehouse floor, refusing to let the heavy weight of my 68 years slow my stride. Inside the cavernous staging area, 5 heavily armed syndicate enforcers had cornered my night shift crew against a towering wall of wooden shipping crates. The enforcers gripped heavy steel pipes and tactical firearms, their postures screaming reckless aggression. The shift supervisor, a hard-working young man named Terrence, stood bravely in front of his terrified crew, bleeding from a fresh cut above his eye. The lead enforcer, a muscular man with a thick scar cutting across his jaw, shouted orders while pouring a large canister of raw gasoline over a line of pristine freight engines. He roared that if Jordan did not appear with the remaining balance of the debt within 10 minutes, every single truck in the fleet would be reduced to ash. The workers braced themselves for the inevitable violence. I did not call out for help or attempt to negotiate from the shadows. I walked past the idling black vehicles and stepped directly into the harsh overhead light of the loading bay. I was completely unarmed, dressed in a torn tweed jacket and an ill-fitting catering shirt. but I carried the absolute unyielding authority of a man who built this empire from the dirt up. "Leave my men and my trucks alone," I stated evenly. The lead enforcer turned around the gasoline canister swinging dangerously in his right hand. He looked me up and down, taking in my gray hair and bruised wrists, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He told the terrified workers that their boss had sent a senile old man to pay a multi-million-dollar blood debt. I did not flinch. I took 2 steps forward and looked the enforcer dead in the eyes. I calmly recited his name, his operational territory, and the exact routes his syndicate used to run untaxed materials through the eastern seaboard. 40 years ago, before I secured legitimate federal contracts, I navigated those exact same hostile supply chains to keep my trucks moving. I detailed his current fuel costs, his border checkpoint bribes, and his exact dwindling profit margins. I proved instantly that I understood the logistical underworld far better than a low-level debt collector playing with matches. The smile completely vanished from his scarred face. He dropped the gasoline canister, suddenly realizing he was not dealing with a fragile civilian. I told him that burning my fleet would yield absolutely zero financial return for his bosses, and would only trigger a massive federal investigation that would freeze their entire illicit operation. I then presented a highly calculated business proposition. I offered his syndicate a completely legitimate, incredibly lucrative freight contract through a quiet secondary holding company I maintained strictly for private investments. The contract would perfectly launder their existing logistical assets and guarantee a steady legal revenue stream. The only conditions were that they immediately erase the entirety of Jordan's remaining debt, walk out of my warehouse without causing another fraction of damage, and never step foot on Vanguard property again. I made it absolutely clear that if they rejected my offer and sparked a single match, I would use my immense corporate wealth to bankrupt their entire syndicate through relentless legal and financial warfare. The choice was between guaranteed sustained profit or total annihilation. I stood my ground, waiting for his greed to override his violent instructions. The lead enforcer stared at me, his mind racing to calculate the sheer value of the arrangement. He was a violent man, but he was not a stupid one. He quickly realized the legal ironclad freight contract I offered was worth at least 10 times the amount of the petty debt Jordan had failed to pay. He gestured sharply to his heavily armed crew, ordering them to lower their weapons and step away from the frightened warehouse workers. The tension in the cavernous staging area evaporated instantly as the syndicate thugs lowered their steel pipes and holstered their firearms. The lead enforcer gave a curt, respectful nod, verbally accepting the terms of the deal. The workers exhaled collectively, slumping against the shipping crates in sheer disbelief. By stepping directly into the line of fire and protecting them from absolute ruin, I cemented the undying loyalty of the entire night shift staff. Terrence wiped the blood from his forehead and looked at me with profound reverence. I had proven that Vanguard Trust was not just a corporate entity, but a shield that actively protected its own people. The enforcers turned and walked back toward their black vehicles parked across the loading bays. Before stepping into the driver's seat, the lead enforcer paused and reached into his dark leather jacket. He pulled out a small metallic silver flash drive and tossed it directly onto a nearby shipping crate. It skidded across the wood and stopped at my feet. He looked at me with a grim, humorless expression. "Your son is not just in debt," the enforcer stated coldly over the roar of the revving engines. "He has been using your primary freight trucks to smuggle highly illegal contraband across state lines for the last 6 months. The sports utility vehicles sped out of the warehouse yard, leaving me alone with my exhausted crew. I stared down at the small silver device glinting under the warehouse lights. Jordan had not merely stolen from the pension fund. He had actively turned my legitimate, hard-earned logistics empire into a massive federal crime scene. I walked into the secure logistics office situated just above the main warehouse floor. The harsh fluorescent lighting buzzed above me as I booted up an encrypted laptop I kept locked in a fireproof safe. I took the small metallic silver flash drive the syndicate enforcer had thrown at me and plugged it directly into the port. As the files decrypted, rows of heavily altered shipping manifests populated the screen. I put on my reading glasses, tracing the falsified routing numbers and the specific vehicle identification codes. The reality of the betrayal was staggering. Jordan had systematically taken 3 of my newest, most expensive freight trucks offline under the guise of routine maintenance. The blueprints hidden within the drive proved he had illegally modified their chassis, installing highly sophisticated hidden compartments beneath the primary sleeper cabs. He was using my legitimate federally licensed logistics company to transport millions of dollars in stolen, black market electronics straight across state lines. He had essentially turned the very fleet I built with my bare hands into a massive rolling federal crime syndicate, fully intending to let me take the absolute blame if the authorities ever caught wind of his operation. Before I could fully process the sheer depth of his criminal negligence, my secure mobile phone vibrated violently against the desk. It was Bradley calling me on the encrypted channel we established earlier that night. His voice was breathless and completely stripped of his usual professional calm. He told me he had just received an emergency back-channel alert from an old law school contact working at the state courthouse. Megan was absolutely furious that I had outsmarted her fake assault setup at the country club and walked out of the police precinct a free man. In a desperate scorched earth retaliation to destroy me completely, she had placed an anonymous, highly detailed tip directly to the Federal Department of Transportation. She deliberately handed them the exact license plate numbers of the 3 modified trucks and claimed the company chief executive was currently overseeing a massive smuggling operation. Bradley warned me that a joint federal inspection team, heavily backed by armed state troopers, had just been dispatched. They were scheduled to execute a full-scale, unannounced raid on my primary warehouse at exactly 6 in the morning. They had full authorization to tear every single truck in the yard apart until they found the illegal goods. The stakes were instantly elevated from a family dispute to complete corporate annihilation. If the federal transportation inspectors breached those gates and discovered the stolen electronics hidden inside my vehicles, the government would immediately seize Vanguard Holding Trust under federal racketeering laws. Every single bank account would be permanently frozen, the warehouse would be chained shut, and I would spend the rest of my natural life rotting inside a federal penitentiary. I looked up at the digital clock glowing red on the office wall. It was exactly 3 in the morning. I had less than 3 hours before the heavily armed raid commenced. I did not waste precious seconds panicking or calling for outside help. I stood up, stripped off the torn white catering shirt and the heavy tweed jacket, and rolled up my sleeves. I walked down the metal stairs to the main floor, headed straight for my personal storage locker, and grabbed my rusted 50-pound mechanic toolbox. I marched out toward the dark garage bays where the 3 compromised trucks were parked. I unlocked the heavy garage bay doors and turned on the high-intensity halogen work lights. The 3 massive diesel trucks sat side by side, their metallic paint gleaming under the harsh illumination. I slid underneath the first truck on a wheeled mechanic creeper, aiming a flashlight at the modified undercarriage. Jordan had paid a professional fabricator to weld reinforced steel plates over the hidden compartments, securing them with heavy industrial bolts. I grabbed an impact wrench and a portable acetylene torch and went straight to work. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. I am a 68-year-old man, and my shoulders burned with intense, agonizing fire as I forced the rusted bolts loose. My arthritic knuckles scraped against the jagged steel underbelly of the truck, tearing the skin and leaving trails of warm blood across my hands. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes in the humid, suffocating heat of the garage. I was essentially performing the grueling, back-breaking labor of 3 fully trained mechanics racing against a ticking clock to dismantle a heavily reinforced criminal enterprise. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I refused to stop. I was fighting to save my legacy. For over 2 hours, the garage echoed with the deafening sound of grinding metal, hissing torches, and heavy steel plates crashing to the concrete floor. I systematically ripped open the false bottoms of the sleeper cabs, pulling out dozens of heavy black duffel bags packed tightly with the stolen electronics. I dragged the contraband to a secure lead-lined incinerator chute at the back of the property, dumping the illegal evidence down the disposal shaft to be completely destroyed. With the bags gone, I crawled back under the massive vehicles with my welding mask and torch. I rapidly welded the original steel panels back into their proper places, sealing the compartments shut forever. To hide the shiny, freshly welded seams from the federal inspectors, I grabbed a heavy bucket of thick black engine grease and smeared it aggressively over the new joints, making the undercarriage look entirely old and undisturbed. By 5:45 in the morning, the last bolt was tightened. I dropped the heavy wrench onto the concrete and collapsed against the massive front tire of the 3rd truck. I was completely drenched in sweat, covered in black grease and dried blood, totally exhausted but deeply victorious. I sat on the cold concrete floor, letting the heavy rhythm of my breathing slowly return to normal. The sky outside the garage windows began to turn a pale, hazy blue as the sun crested the horizon. At exactly 6 in the morning, the harsh, unmistakable screech of heavy tires echoed through the front compound. The blare of police sirens shattered the quiet dawn. I stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from my eyes, and walked toward the open warehouse bay. A convoy of white government vehicles and marked state trooper cruisers aggressively blocked the main gates. The lead Department of Transportation inspector stepped out of his vehicle, flanked by heavily armed officers ready to raid my facility. But my eyes immediately locked onto the sleek silver luxury sedan parked directly behind the police cruisers. The passenger door opened and Megan stepped out onto the damp pavement. She was holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee, wearing a pristine designer trench coat, arriving early to personally witness my federal arrest and the absolute downfall of my entire empire. Megan leaned against the polished hood of her silver sedan, taking a slow and arrogant sip from her expensive coffee cup. A wicked, triumphant smile stretched across her face as the lead inspector for the Department of Transportation barked harsh orders to his heavily armed state troopers. The officers immediately swarmed the 3 specific freight trucks parked in the center of the loading bay. They brought out heavy pry bars, industrial flashlights, and tactical inspection mirrors, preparing to dismantle the massive vehicles piece by piece. They expected to find millions of dollars in stolen black market electronics and instantly secure my federal arrest warrant. I did not panic. I simply pulled an overturned wooden shipping crate near the open garage door and sat down. I unscrewed the cap of my battered steel thermos, poured myself a cup of bitter black coffee, and watched the chaos unfold. My muscles ached terribly from the brutal labor I had just endured, but a profound sense of calm washed over me. I watched the aggressive state troopers crawl directly underneath the massive diesel engines, aiming their bright beams of light at the exact steel plates I had just painstakingly welded shut and aggressively covered in thick engine grease. For 45 grueling minutes, the state troopers tore through the sleeper cabs, ripped up the floor mats, and aggressively pounded on the reinforced undercarriages of the 3 targeted trucks. The lead inspector grew increasingly frustrated as his team repeatedly came up entirely empty-handed. He crawled out from under the 3rd vehicle, wiping thick, dark engine grease from his uniform, and aggressively shook his head at his commanding officer. They found absolutely nothing but standard mechanical components and solid, undisturbed steel. Megan's smug, victorious smile evaporated, instantly replaced by a sudden and frantic confusion. She stepped away from her luxury sedan and marched directly toward the loading dock, completely abandoning her polished socialite persona. She raised her voice aggressively, demanding the federal inspectors stop wasting time and search the vehicles much harder. She insisted they were incompetent and completely missing the obvious evidence. In her blind, adulterated rage at seeing me sitting calmly on the wooden crate, she made a catastrophic and irreversible psychological error. She began shouting highly specific mechanical instructions to the state troopers, demanding they physically cut open the reinforced steel plates located specifically beneath the secondary exhaust lines. She accidentally revealed that she possessed intimate, deeply technical knowledge of a massive smuggling operation she supposedly had absolutely nothing to do with. I knew exactly when to strike. I stood up from the wooden shipping crate, brushed the sawdust from my pants, and walked casually toward the lead federal inspector. I reached into the front pocket of my bag and handed him a thick manila folder. Inside that folder were the meticulously forged shipping manifests I had decrypted just hours earlier, clearly bearing Jordan-authorized digital signatures. As the inspector reviewed the fraudulent paperwork, I raised my voice so every state trooper in the warehouse yard could hear me clearly. I pointed directly at Megan, who was still aggressively barking mechanical instructions at the confused officers. I calmly asked the federal inspector why a civilian housewife, a woman who had never worked a single day on a logistics loading dock or held a commercial trucking license, possessed such an intimate and hyper-specific understanding of welded subfloors and illegal vehicle modifications. I asked him to consider how she knew the exact anatomical layout of a black market smuggling compartment if she was merely a concerned and innocent citizen making an anonymous tip. The federal inspector slowly lowered the forged manifests and turned his full, unyielding attention directly onto Megan. His eyes narrowed with intense professional suspicion. The armed state troopers stopped searching my freight trucks and simultaneously turned to face her, realizing the anonymous tipster standing before them was actively implicating herself in a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. Megan froze entirely as the sheer gravity of her arrogant mistake crashed down upon her. The blood drained completely from her face. Her lips parted, but she could not formulate a single coherent excuse to explain her vast knowledge of the illegal vehicular modifications. Flustered, hyperventilating, and entirely consumed by sudden panic, she dropped her expensive coffee cup onto the damp concrete. She stumbled backward, turned around, and sprinted frantically toward her silver luxury sedan. She scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the car into gear, and sped aggressively out of the warehouse compound, her tires screeching violently against the pavement. The lead inspector watched her flee, shook his head in absolute disgust, and officially ordered his team to stand down. The state troopers cleared the warehouse yard entirely, leaving me and my logistics company completely in the clear. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cool morning air, believing I finally had a brief moment of breathing room to plan my next strategic move against Jordan. But before the dust could even settle in the loading yard, my secure backup phone rang sharply. I answered it immediately. It was Tanya, a brilliant young accountant who worked on the 8th floor of my corporate headquarters. Her voice was barely a trembling whisper, vibrating with absolute and sheer terror. Tanya told me she had secretly stayed overnight at the office to dig into the internal corporate financial servers on my behalf. She proudly whispered that she had successfully located Jordan Master's shadow ledger, the exact digital file that irrevocably proved he had personally authorized the forged signatures to steal the $12 million employee pension fund. However, the victory was incredibly short-lived. She tearfully explained that Jordan had just arrived at the building with a team of violent, off-the-books private security thugs. They realized someone had breached the financial firewall and had completely locked the building down. Tanya was currently hiding under a desk, physically trapped inside the heavily fortified corporate server room, while Jordan men aggressively scoured the floors searching for the whistleblower. I ordered Tanya to remain perfectly silent and stay hidden beneath the desk, promising her that I was on my way to get her out safely. Before I could even finish my sentence, a loud and violent crash echoed through the phone speaker. The heavy, reinforced glass door of the server room was being aggressively battered from the outside. Tanya let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream as the sound of shattering glass erupted through the receiver, and then the line went completely dead. I stared at the disconnected phone in my grease-stained hand. Jordan was actively hunting down innocent people to protect his crumbling criminal empire. I tossed my empty coffee thermos aside and sprinted toward my car. I knew I had no other choice. I had to personally break into my own heavily guarded corporate headquarters, bypass an entire team of hostile armed mercenaries, rescue the terrified young accountant, and secure the ultimate financial evidence required to destroy my son before he could silence her forever. Megan leaned against the polished hood of her silver sedan, taking a slow and arrogant sip from her expensive coffee cup. A wicked, triumphant smile stretched across her face as the lead inspector for the Department of Transportation barked harsh orders to his heavily armed state troopers. The officers immediately swarmed the 3 specific freight trucks parked in the center of the loading bay. They brought out heavy pry bars, industrial flashlights, and tactical inspection mirrors, preparing to dismantle the massive vehicles piece by piece. They expected to find millions of dollars in stolen black market electronics and instantly secure my federal arrest warrant. I did not panic. I simply pulled an overturned wooden shipping crate near the open garage door and sat down. I unscrewed the cap of my battered steel thermos, poured myself a cup of bitter black coffee, and watched the chaos unfold. My muscles ached terribly from the brutal labor I had just endured, but a profound sense of calm washed over me. I watched the aggressive state troopers crawl directly underneath the massive diesel engines, aiming their bright beams of light at the exact steel plates I had just painstakingly welded shut and aggressively covered in thick engine grease. For 45 grueling minutes, the state troopers tore through the sleeper cabs, ripped up the floor mats, and aggressively pounded on the reinforced undercarriages of the 3 targeted trucks. The lead inspector grew increasingly frustrated as his team repeatedly came up entirely empty-handed. He crawled out from under the 3rd vehicle, wiping thick, dark engine grease from his uniform, and aggressively shook his head at his commanding officer. They found absolutely nothing but standard mechanical components and solid, undisturbed steel. Megan's smug, victorious smile evaporated, instantly replaced by a sudden and frantic confusion. She stepped away from her luxury sedan and marched directly toward the loading dock, completely abandoning her polished socialite persona. She raised her voice aggressively, demanding the federal inspectors stop wasting time and search the vehicles much harder. She insisted they were incompetent and completely missing the obvious evidence. In her blind, unadulterated rage at seeing me sitting calmly on the wooden crate, she made a catastrophic and irreversible psychological error. She began shouting highly specific mechanical instructions to the state troopers, demanding they physically cut open the reinforced steel plates located specifically beneath the secondary exhaust lines. She accidentally revealed that she possessed intimate, deeply technical knowledge of a massive smuggling operation she supposedly had absolutely nothing to do with. I knew exactly when to strike. I stood up from the wooden shipping crate, brushed the sawdust from my pants, and walked casually toward the lead federal inspector. I reached into the front pocket of my bag and handed him a thick manila folder. Inside that folder were the meticulously forged shipping manifests I had decrypted just hours earlier, clearly bearing Jordan-authorized digital signatures. As the inspector reviewed the fraudulent paperwork, I raised my voice so every state trooper in the warehouse yard could hear me clearly. I pointed directly at Megan, who was still aggressively barking mechanical instructions at the confused officers. I calmly asked the federal inspector why a civilian housewife, a woman who had never worked a single day on a logistics loading dock or held a commercial trucking license, possessed such an intimate and hyper-specific understanding of welded subfloors and illegal vehicle modifications. I asked him to consider how she knew the exact anatomical layout of a black market smuggling compartment if she was merely a concerned and innocent citizen making an anonymous tip. The federal inspector slowly lowered the forged manifests and turned his full, unyielding attention directly onto Megan. His eyes narrowed with intense professional suspicion. The armed state troopers stopped searching my freight trucks and simultaneously turned to face her, realizing the anonymous tipster standing before them was actively implicating herself in a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. Megan froze entirely as the sheer gravity of her arrogant mistake crashed down upon her. The blood drained completely from her face. Her lips parted, but she could not formulate a single coherent excuse to explain her vast knowledge of the illegal vehicular modifications. Flustered, hyperventilating, and entirely consumed by sudden panic, she dropped her expensive coffee cup onto the damp concrete. She stumbled backward, turned around, and sprinted frantically toward her silver luxury sedan. She scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the car into gear, and sped aggressively out of the warehouse compound, her tires screeching violently against the pavement. The lead inspector watched her flee, shook his head in absolute disgust, and officially ordered his team to stand down. The state troopers cleared the warehouse yard entirely, leaving me and my logistics company completely in the clear. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cool morning air, believing I finally had a brief moment of breathing room to plan my next strategic move against Jordan. But before the dust could even settle in the loading yard, my secure backup phone rang sharply. I answered it immediately. It was Tanya, a brilliant young accountant who worked on the 8th floor of my corporate headquarters. Her voice was barely a trembling whisper, vibrating with absolute and sheer terror. Tanya told me she had secretly stayed overnight at the office to dig into the internal corporate financial servers on my behalf. She proudly whispered that she had successfully located Jordan Master's shadow ledger, the exact digital file that irrevocably proved he had personally authorized the forged signatures to steal the $12 million employee pension fund. However, the victory was incredibly short-lived. She tearfully explained that Jordan had just arrived at the building with a team of violent, off-the-books private security thugs. They realized someone had breached the financial firewall and had completely locked the building down. Tanya was currently hiding under a desk, physically trapped inside the heavily fortified corporate server room, while Jordan men aggressively scoured the floors searching for the whistleblower. I ordered Tanya to remain perfectly silent and stay hidden beneath the desk, promising her that I was on my way to get her out safely. Before I could even finish my sentence, a loud and violent crash echoed through the phone speaker. The heavy, reinforced glass door of the server room was being aggressively battered from the outside. Tanya let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream as the sound of shattering glass erupted through the receiver, and then the line went completely dead. I stared at the disconnected phone in my grease-stained hand. Jordan was actively hunting down innocent people to protect his crumbling criminal empire. I tossed my empty coffee thermos aside and sprinted toward my car. I knew I had no other choice. I had to personally break into my own heavily guarded corporate headquarters, bypass an entire team of hostile armed mercenaries, rescue the terrified young accountant, and secure the ultimate financial evidence required to destroy my son before he could silence her forever. I drove my vehicle toward the towering glass and steel headquarters of Apex Logistics, pushing the engine as hard as I dared through the early morning Atlanta traffic. The sun was fully up now, casting bright reflections off the massive corporate building I had funded and built. I parked a block away in a mundane retail structure to avoid drawing attention and approached the main plaza on foot. Peering around a heavy concrete planter, I immediately saw that Jordan had completely locked down the facility. The familiar, friendly faces of the security guards I had employed for over a decade were entirely gone. In their place stood a team of heavily armed private military contractors dressed in tactical black gear, patrolling the sweeping front lobby with aggressive vigilance. Jordan had essentially turned my own corporate headquarters into a hostile, militarized fortress. Walking directly through those revolving glass front doors was an absolute impossibility. I would be tackled, detained, and handed straight over to the corrupt psychiatric orderlies before I ever reached the elevators. I needed an alternative route inside one that Jordan's arrogant, entitled mind would never think to secure. Jordan only understood the polished executive suites and the massive boardrooms. He had absolutely zero understanding of the actual physical infrastructure keeping the towering skyscraper operational. 20 years ago, when the building was still just a blueprint, I personally sat down with the lead architects and engineers. I insisted on designing a highly specific compartmentalized layout for the heating, ventilation, and maintenance tunnels. I wanted my maintenance crews to be able to service the entire structure without ever having to haul heavy tools through the pristine public spaces. Because of this, I knew a completely blind entrance existed. I slipped away from the main plaza and descended a steep concrete ramp leading down into the subterranean parking garage. Avoiding the erratic sweeps of the security cameras, I made my way to the darkest corner of the lowest parking level. Behind a heavy, unmarked steel door disguised as a utility closet lay a narrow concrete maintenance corridor. I unlocked it using a master skeleton key I had carried on my keychain for 2 decades. At the end of this damp, forgotten hallway was a hidden manual service elevator. It was designed exclusively for heavy freight and janitorial staff, completely bypassing the heavily guarded main lobby above. The service elevator carried me upward with a low mechanical hum, depositing me directly onto the 8th floor. I stepped out into the dark, silent corporate hallways. The main overhead lights were completely shut off, leaving only the faint greenish glow of emergency exit signs to guide my path. I moved stealthily along the carpeted corridors, keeping my back pressed firmly against the expensive mahogany wall paneling. As I rounded the corner toward the primary financial wing, the violent, rhythmic sound of heavy metal striking reinforced glass echoed loudly through the empty space. I peered around the edge of a cubicle partition and saw 2 massive security thugs wielding a heavy steel fire extinguisher like a battering ram. They were relentlessly smashing it against the thick frosted glass door of the central server room. Through the spiderweb cracks rapidly forming in the reinforced glass, I could see Tanya. The young accountant was curled tightly under a metal desk, sobbing into her hands, completely terrified as the thugs prepared to breach the room. I knew better than to engage 2 heavily armed mercenaries in a direct physical brawl. I was a strong man, but I was still 68 years old, and a fistfight would only delay Tanya's rescue and alert the rest of Jordan men. I needed to neutralize them instantly, using the environment to my absolute advantage. I crept backward toward a recessed wall panel I knew housed the emergency fire suppression override controls for this specific financial wing. I smashed the protective clear plastic casing with the heavy heel of my hand and forcefully pulled the manual release lever straight downward. I completely bypassed the standard water sprinklers and directly engaged the localized halon gas and heavy chemical foam suppression system. Immediately, a deafening mechanical alarm shrieked loudly from the ceiling. A split second later, the overhead vents aggressively deployed thick, blinding white chemical foam and heavy halon gas directly into the enclosed hallway. The 2 thugs dropped the heavy steel fire extinguisher, instantly coughing violently as the thick foam coated their tactical gear and the gas severely restricted the oxygen in their lungs. They stumbled blindly against the walls, completely incapacitated and choking in the sudden, overwhelming whiteout conditions. Covering my own mouth and nose with the collar of my shirt, I rushed through the thick, swirling chemical gas toward the server room. I kicked the severely cracked glass door with my heavy work boot, shattering it completely inward in a shower of sharp fragments. I reached under the metal desk, grabbed Tanya firmly by the arm, and hauled her quickly to her feet. She was shaking uncontrollably, but she bravely thrust a small, heavy-duty black flash drive directly into my hand. She frantically whispered that it contained the master ledger proving every single forged signature Jordan had authorized. I securely pocketed the drive, wrapped my arm around her shoulder to keep her steady, and guided her rapidly back down the corridor through the dissipating white foam. We reached the hidden service elevator and stepped inside just as the main executive elevator doors slid open at the far end of the hall. Jordan stepped out frantically, waving the thick white smoke away from his face. He began coughing aggressively, his expensive bespoke suit immediately ruined by the chemical residue. He looked down the long hallway just in time to see the heavy metal doors of my service elevator securely closing. The absolute realization washed over his terrified, pale face. He knew he had been completely outplayed inside his own supposed fortress. We safely rode the service elevator down to the basement, slipped past the underground cameras, and immediately flagged down a passing taxi. Within 30 minutes, Tanya and I were securely locked inside the downtown law offices of Bradley Pierce. Bradley poured the exhausted accountant a cup of hot tea while I handed him the heavy-duty black flash drive. "This is the definitive proof that Jordan emptied the pension fund and committed federal fraud," I told him, feeling a sudden surge of triumph. Bradley quickly plugged the device into his secure desktop computer. His triumphant smile vanished the second the files loaded onto the screen. He let out a deep, frustrated groan and slammed his fist against the desk. The master ledger was completely locked behind a military-grade biometric encryption wall. It was a highly advanced failsafe put in place by the political mastermind behind the entire hostile takeover. Bradley looked at me with a grim, defeated expression. He told me no computer hacker on Earth could break this specific code. The only physical way to open those files and save my company was by securing the live thumbprint of Megan's deeply corrupt father, Gregory. Staring at the blinking red access denied prompt on Bradley's computer screen, the reality of our immense roadblock settled over the room. The military-grade biometric encryption on the master ledger required a live scan of Gregory's thumbprint to bypass the firewall. Physically forcing a powerful, heavily guarded politician to press his thumb onto a flash drive was completely impossible. However, Tanya quickly pointed out a crucial digital loophole. Gregory utilized his personal smartphone to remotely approve all of his offshore shell company transfers. That meant his precise biometric signature was permanently cached within the encrypted security token of the device itself. If we could physically acquire his smartphone and directly bridge it to our flash drive, Tanya bypass software could extract the cached fingerprint data and force the ledger open. Securing that specific phone was our only remaining option. Gregory was scheduled to host a massive, highly publicized political fundraising gala that very evening at a luxury downtown venue. The event would be absolutely swarming with elite donors, state officials, and heavily armed security details. I realized the only way to secure the biometric token was to infiltrate the heavily guarded gala and steal the smartphone straight from his jacket. I left Bradley's office and returned to my temporary safe house to prepare for the infiltration. I discarded my grease-stained work clothes and pulled a pristine, custom-tailored black suit from the back of my closet. It was a classic, understated garment I had purchased years ago for high-level corporate negotiations designed to project absolute authority without drawing unnecessary attention. Bradley utilized his extensive network of political fixers to procure a flawless forged VIP access lanyard bearing my photograph under a fictitious identity. I arrived at the glittering downtown event hall just as the evening hit its peak. Stepping out of my vehicle, I projected the confident, untouchable aura of a wealthy, silent donor. I walked straight past the aggressive security perimeter, handing my forged credential to the door staff. The scanner flashed a reassuring green, and I stepped smoothly into the grand chandelier-lit ballroom. The space was completely packed with the city's most influential and corrupt elites, all sipping expensive champagne while writing massive campaign checks. I navigated the crowded room with practiced ease, keeping my face angled away from the primary event photographers. Near the back of the room, standing on an elevated VIP platform, I spotted Gregory holding court. He was surrounded by a thick wall of wealthy donors and imposing private security contractors, laughing arrogantly, while completely unaware that his financial empire was on the verge of collapse. Getting close enough to a heavily guarded politician to pick his pocket required a flawless distraction. Before arriving at the venue, I had instructed Rufus to leverage his banquet connections and secure a temporary shift serving drinks at the gala. I caught Rufus' eye across the crowded ballroom and gave him a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Rufus immediately pushed a towering catering cart loaded with hundreds of crystal champagne flutes directly toward the edge of the elevated VIP platform. Just as he approached Gregory's tightly packed entourage, Rufus aggressively twisted the cartwheels, sending the entire structure crashing violently onto the polished marble floor. The deafening sound of shattering crystal echoed like an explosion, sending glass flying everywhere. The wealthy donors shrieked and leaped backward, while Gregory's security detail instinctively rushed forward to shield him from the chaos. In that split second of absolute panic and misdirection, I slipped smoothly into the opening. I bumped firmly against Gregory's side, apologizing profusely for losing my balance. In one fluid, practiced motion, I slid my hand into his tailored suit jacket, lifted his personal smartphone, and vanished back into the frantic crowd without leaving a trace. I quickly removed myself from the main ballroom and headed straight for the secluded luxury restrooms located down a quiet venue corridor. The hallway was completely deserted as staff rushed toward the ballroom to clean the massive glass spill. I ducked into the furthest bathroom stall, locked the heavy door, and pulled Gregory's smartphone from my pocket. I retrieved the compact wired decryption device Tanya had configured back at the law office. I plugged the braided data cable directly into Gregory's phone and connected the other end to the encrypted flash drive holding the master ledger. I pressed the activation button on the device, initiating the biometric bypass sequence. A small digital screen flickered to life, displaying a crawling progress bar as the software aggressively mined the phone-cached data to extract the thumbprint token. I stared at the screen, listening to the muffled sounds of the gala outside. The progress bar inched forward with agonizing slowness. It hit 80%, then 85%. My heart hammered steadily against my ribs, 90%, 95%. I held my breath waiting for the final green light to unlock the evidence. Just as the digital display ticked up to 98%, the heavy wooden door of the restroom stall was kicked open with a tremendous violent force. The metal lock shattered, sending splinters of wood flying across the tiled floor. I stepped back instinctively, shielding the decryption device with my body. Jordan marched into the confined space, his chest heaving with aggressive, ragged breaths. He quickly turned and slid the heavy deadbolt on the main restroom door, completely isolating us from the rest of the venue. His bespoke suit was rumpled, and his eyes were wild with a feral, desperate rage. Megan Country Club contacts had spotted my forged VIP pass in the registry system and immediately alerted him to my presence at the gala. He knew exactly what I was trying to do. Without uttering a single word of hesitation, Jordan reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid steel mechanic wrench. He gripped the weapon tightly, his knuckles turning white as he advanced toward me. He looked at the glowing decryption device humming quietly in my hand and raised the heavy steel wrench above his shoulder. "Give me the drive, old man," Jordan demanded, his voice dropping into a vicious, unrecognizable snarl. "You are not going to destroy my life tonight." I did not cower or beg my son for mercy. I stood my ground, staring directly into the eyes of the ruthless stranger he had chosen to become. I maintained absolute eye contact as the digital screen on the decryption device finally flashed a solid bright green. The display hit 100%. The master ledger was completely unsealed. I calmly detached the flash drive, slipped the ultimate piece of criminal evidence securely into my inside jacket pocket, and let the device fall uselessly to the floor. "You destroyed your own life the second you chose greed over loyalty," I told him, my voice radiating unwavering authority. "The money is gone and your fraudulent empire is finished." I stepped forward, prepared to walk straight past him. But Jordan was no longer operating on logic. Driven by absolute blind panic and the terrifying realization that he had definitively lost, he let out a guttural scream. He lunged directly at me, swinging the heavy steel wrench with lethal intent, violently cornering me against the cold tile wall in the inescapable space of the locked restroom. Jordan swung the heavy steel wrench with a wild and desperate cry. He aimed directly for my head, completely consumed by the blind panic of a man watching his entire fabricated life crumble. But Jordan had spent his entire adulthood sitting behind expensive mahogany desks, while I had spent 40 years wrestling frozen cargo doors and muscling heavy machinery. I did not flinch. My reflexes were forged in the grueling environment of loading docks. I simply stepped to the side, letting the heavy momentum of the wrench pull him entirely off balance. As he stumbled forward, I grabbed his wrist with my calloused hands. I applied a simple and highly practiced leverage technique I had used countless times to secure heavy chains on flatbed trailers. I twisted his arm sharply downward. The wrench slipped from his trembling grip and clattered loudly against the cold bathroom tiles. I kicked the weapon out of reach and pushed my son firmly against the marble sink. He had absolutely no fight left in him. The adrenaline that fueled his sudden attack evaporated instantly, leaving him gasping for air and staring at me with wide and terrified eyes. Jordan's legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the polished tile floor, sliding down the side of the marble vanity until he was curled into a pathetic, weeping heap. The arrogant corporate executive who had confidently shoved disownment papers into my chest just 24 hours ago was entirely gone. In his place sat a broken and cowardly boy, sobbing uncontrollably. Instead of owning up to the massive federal crimes he had actively committed, he immediately began to deflect the blame. He cried that Megan had forced him into the gambling syndicate debt, claiming her insatiable appetite for luxury had driven him to embezzle the pension funds. He blamed the shifting economy, stating that the logistics market was too competitive and he had no other choice but to cut corners. He even had the sheer audacity to blame me, crying that I had never loved him enough, that my quiet nature made him feel inadequate, and that he only stole the money to finally prove he was smarter than I was. He refused to take a single ounce of absolute accountability for his own actions. Every excuse he spat out was a desperate attempt to portray himself as a tragic victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own destruction. I looked down at my weeping son, feeling a profound and heavy sorrow settling deep into my chest. A very specific memory suddenly flashed through my mind. I remembered running alongside him in our old driveway when he was 7 years old, teaching him how to ride a bicycle. Every single time he wobbled or lost his balance, I would instantly catch him before his knees ever scraped the pavement. My late wife Miriam had gently warned me that a boy needs to fall occasionally so he can learn how to pick himself back up. I ignored her advice, determined to shield my only child from the harsh physical and financial struggles I had endured. Looking at him now crying on the bathroom floor, the horrifying realization finally hit me. By constantly acting as his invisible safety net and insulating him from every single hardship, I had accidentally raised a monster. I created an entitled man who believed the world simply owed him a flawless existence, completely incapable of handling the absolute consequences of his own failure. I turned my back on Jordan and left him sobbing on the cold tile floor. I unlocked the heavy bathroom door, stepped out into the quiet corridor, and walked briskly out of the gala venue. Bradley was waiting for me in a dark sedan idling 2 blocks away. I climbed into the passenger seat and handed him the fully decrypted flash drive. Bradley immediately plugged the device into his secure laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The master ledger finally opened, revealing the absolute depths of the corruption. But the financial records were not the most devastating piece of evidence hidden inside Gregory's personal files. Nestled within a separate encrypted folder were dozens of heavily guarded text messages and drafted legal contracts between Megan and her corrupt politician father. The documents contained the ultimate weapon. They detailed a meticulously crafted contingency plan to actively frame Jordan for every single ounce of the massive corporate embezzlement. Gregory had intentionally structured the offshore transfers to leave a digital trail pointing directly back to my son. They were treating Jordan as a completely disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat. They fully intended to sacrifice the moment the federal authorities caught wind of the missing pension funds. As I read the damning text messages illuminated on the laptop screen, a cold and calculating anger washed over me. Megan was actively preparing to sacrifice her own husband to save herself and her corrupt family from federal prison. Despite the fact that Jordan had betrayed me in the most vicious and public way imaginable, I absolutely refused to let my son be slaughtered by a greedy socialite and a dirty politician. Jordan needed to face the severe legal consequences of his own specific crimes, but he was not going to take the ultimate fall for Gregory's grand embezzlement scheme. I realized the most effective way to dismantle their entire operation was not to fight them head-on, but to destroy the foundation of their toxic alliance from the inside out. I decided to violently splinter Megan and Jordan's marriage permanently. If Jordan realized his wife was actively orchestrating his federal demise, his remaining loyalty to her would evaporate instantly. The fragile criminal trust holding their entire scheme together would shatter into a million pieces. They would turn on each other like starved wolves, tearing their own conspiracy apart from the inside before the federal inspectors even filed the first batch of official legal charges. I instructed Bradley to compile the specific text messages and the fraudulent offshore routing numbers into a single anonymous digital package. I hit send, routing the devastating evidence of Megan betrayal directly to Jordan's personal email inbox. I wanted him to read exactly how his wife planned to destroy him while he was still sitting on that bathroom floor. Bradley put the car into gear and we drove away from the downtown district, believing we had secured the upper hand. But we had vastly underestimated the speed of Megan's surveillance network. Minutes later, as we merged onto a dark stretch of the coastal highway, a massive black sports utility vehicle accelerated aggressively behind us. The heavy vehicle slammed violently into our rear bumper, spinning our sedan wildly out of control. Megan had realized the encrypted files were stolen and was no longer playing corporate games. We crashed violently into a steep embankment. The war had just escalated into a scorched earth protocol, and Megan was now actively trying to eliminate us for good. The world spun in a terrifying blur of shattered glass and screeching metal as our sedan tumbled down the steep embankment. We slammed into the muddy trench at the bottom of the ravine with a bone-jarring crunch. The airbags deployed instantly, filling the cabin with a thick haze of white powder and the sharp scent of burning rubber. I pushed the deflated canvas away from my face, my ears ringing violently from the impact. I looked over at Bradley, who was coughing and clutching his shoulder, but thankfully entirely conscious. We kicked the jammed doors open and crawled out into the freezing mud, hiding in the tall grass as the black sports utility vehicle idled ominously on the highway above us. The massive truck lingered just long enough to ensure our vehicle was completely wrecked before its tires screeched and it sped off into the darkness. Megan was no longer hiding behind fraudulent psychiatric warrants or corrupt political connections. She had crossed the absolute line from white-collar corporate manipulation to outright attempted murder. Brushing the dirt from my torn suit, I realized she was actively trying to eliminate us physically before the dawn broke. I helped Bradley climb up the slippery embankment, the cold night air biting at my bruised ribs. We flagged down a passing commercial transport truck, one of my own Vanguard Logistics drivers, who immediately recognized me and offered us safe passage back to the city. Sitting in the heated cabin of the freight truck, I pulled out my secure backup phone. It was finally time to strike directly at the very heart of Megan's source of absolute power. Her arrogance and her financial invincibility were entirely shielded by her father's corrupt political empire. I opened the encrypted folder containing the decrypted master ledger and the damning text messages we had extracted from Gregory's personal smartphone. I bypassed the standard local authorities, entirely knowing Gregory still maintained deep pockets and dirty connections within the city precincts. Instead, I routed the undeniable proof of his offshore shell companies, the stolen employee pension funds, and the coordinated embezzlement conspiracy directly to the private inboxes of 3 major Pulitzer-winning investigative journalists at the national level. I pressed send, simultaneously planting an inescapable digital bomb right beneath his carefully constructed political facade. I knew the media would absolutely devour the evidence of a high-profile politician robbing working-class families. I included specific instructions verifying the biometric encryption keys, ensuring no high-paid lawyer could ever claim the documents were fabricated. The trap was set perfectly. The absolute devastation commenced the very next morning, just as the sun rose over Atlanta. The coordinated news story broke simultaneously across every major national television network and top-tier financial publication. The bold, glaring headlines completely exposed Gregory's hidden offshore accounts and broadcasted his vicious theft of the $12 million employee pension fund to the entire country. The public outrage was instantaneous and completely feral. Gregory's pristine political career, built on decades of carefully manicured lies and bribery, disintegrated into absolute ash in a matter of hours. The sheer magnitude of the exposed financial crimes forced the federal government to act with unprecedented speed. Heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a massive, highly publicized raid directly on his primary campaign headquarters. Live news helicopters circled above as agents carried out dozens of boxes of hard drives and paper records. Gregory was dragged out of his own building in handcuffs, his face pale and utterly humiliated in front of the flashing cameras. The untouchable politician was finally broken. Megan watched her untouchable family empire burn to the ground on live television from the pristine living room of the estate she had tried to steal from me. The arrogant smirk she wore so proudly at the promotion party was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying panic. She knew the federal authorities would be coming for her next, the moment her father began negotiating a plea deal. In a desperate, frantic bid for survival, she threw a handful of expensive designer clothes into a leather duffel bag and pulled out her secure laptop. She intended to immediately access the hidden offshore accounts, transfer the stolen $12 million into a decentralized crypto wallet, and book a private, untraceable flight directly to Switzerland before the Border Patrol flagged her passport. Her fingers trembled violently as she typed her father's master clearance codes into the banking portal, desperate to secure her massive golden parachute. The screen loaded for an agonizing few seconds before displaying a stark, bright red error message indicating a zero balance. She refreshed the page, frantically screaming at the monitor, only to find the offshore accounts had been completely and entirely drained. Every single penny of her stolen wealth was simply gone. She was trapped. While Megan was busy sending mercenaries to run my car off the road, I had already executed the final phase of my financial counterattack. The moment Tanya biometric decryption software successfully unlocked the master ledger in Bradley's office, I did not just copy the files for the journalists. I utilized Gregory's exposed security token to directly access his Cayman Islands shell accounts. Working swiftly alongside my accountant, I initiated a massive, untraceable reverse wire transfer. I systematically rerouted the entire $12 million of stolen pension funds straight back into the highly secure Vanguard employee retirement accounts where they rightfully belonged. I fortified the recovered funds behind a new layer of corporate encryption that Jordan and Megan could never breach. I saved the livelihoods of my 400 warehouse workers before the sun even came up. Megan stared at the zero balance on her screen, the horrifying reality finally sinking into her bones. She was left absolutely penniless, deeply in debt to a violent gambling syndicate, and entirely stripped of her political protection. I had completely neutralized her greatest weapon, leaving her to face the brutal consequences of her own boundless greed without a single dollar to her name. She dropped the laptop onto the floor, her mind fracturing under the weight of her total defeat. The luxurious lifestyle she felt so entitled to had vanished overnight. Destitute, utterly humiliated, and consumed by a blinding feral rage, Megan completely lost her grip on reality. She grabbed her car keys and stormed out of the estate, her mind fixated on a singular destructive goal. She drove her silver sedan erratically across the city, heading straight toward the massive glass and steel headquarters of Apex Logistics. She bypassed the distracted security guards at the front gate, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She pulled her vehicle directly up to the main lobby doors and stepped out holding a heavy industrial red canister filled entirely with raw gasoline. She had lost her money, her status, and her freedom, and she refused to let me walk away victorious. Driven by pure spite, she marched toward the entrance, absolutely intent on burning my entire corporate legacy straight to the ground. She intended to reduce 40 years of my hard work into a pile of smoldering ash, willing to destroy herself if it meant taking my empire down with her. The ultimate confrontation was imminent. The heavy glass doors of Apex Logistics shattered inward with a deafening crash as Megan violently backed her silver sedan straight through the front entrance of my corporate headquarters. I stepped out of the main executive elevator just as the dust began to settle, remaining completely calm and rooted to the spot. Megan crawled out of the driver's seat, her designer trench coat covered in dirt and her pristine blonde hair tangled in a frantic mess. She was holding a heavy red industrial canister, her eyes wide with a feral, unhinged madness born from absolute financial ruin. She unscrewed the cap and began aggressively splashing raw gasoline across the polished marble floors of the lobby, screaming hysterically that if she could not have my empire, nobody would. She shrieked that I had destroyed her family and stolen her future. The sharp, overwhelming stench of fuel filled the massive atrium, but I did not take a single step backward. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my tailored suit, watching the elite socialite completely unravel into a pathetic, desperate criminal right in the middle of the empire she had tried so ruthlessly to steal from me. Megan reached into her pocket and pulled out a silver butane lighter, flipping the metal lid open with a trembling thumb. She held the open flame precariously close to the gasoline-soaked marble, her chest heaving as she threatened to drop it and burn 40 years of my hard work to the ground. I did not beg her to stop, nor did I negotiate with a cornered rat. I simply raised my hand and pointed a single finger toward the high vaulted ceiling of the lobby. I instructed her to look closely at the dozens of circular metallic vents lining the architecture. I calmly explained that a multi-million-dollar logistics hub dealing with highly combustible freight was not protected by standard water sprinklers. The entire building was outfitted with a state-of-the-art localized halon gas and heavy chemical foam suppression system. I told her with absolute unwavering clarity that the exact millisecond she dropped that lighter, the sensors would trigger. The flames would be smothered instantly, and the lobby would flood with dense, blinding chemical foam. I promised her that she would simply suffocate on the floor and survive just long enough to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted arson. Before Megan could process the terrifying reality of the fire suppression system, the shattered remains of the front doors were kicked aside. Jordan burst into the gasoline-soaked lobby, completely out of breath and radiating a vicious, desperate fury. He had finally seen the anonymous email I routed to his phone, the decrypted messages proving unequivocally that Megan and Gregory had meticulously planned to use him as the ultimate scapegoat for their massive embezzlement scheme. He did not run to comfort his wife. He lunged toward her, aggressively slapping the silver lighter out of her hand. It skidded harmlessly across the dry section of the marble floor. Jordan began screaming at the top of his lungs, calling her a worthless parasite and a treacherous snake. He roared that he had ruined his own relationship with his father just to fund her insatiable gambling addiction, only to find out she was actively preparing to feed him to the federal authorities to save her own skin. The two of them immediately turned on each other with a viciousness that was truly pathetic to witness. I stood silently near the elevator bank, watching the incredibly ugly and complete collapse of their toxic marriage. Megan shrieked that Jordan was a weak, spineless coward who could not even successfully manage a simple corporate takeover without bungling the offshore transfers. Jordan fired back, screaming that he personally forged the truck manifests and stole the $12 million solely because her corrupt father blackmailed him into doing it. They were so utterly consumed by their mutual hatred and desperation to shift the blame that they completely failed to notice the flashing red and blue lights silently pulling up to the shattered lobby entrance. I had personally contacted the local precinct 10 minutes before Megan even arrived, alerting them to a hostile intruder. 6 heavily armed police officers stepped quietly through the broken glass doors. They stood perfectly still, their body cameras recording every single second of the screaming match. Without needing any further interrogation, the officers captured high-definition audio of both Jordan and Megan openly admitting to massive federal embezzlement, forgery, and illegal smuggling right in the middle of my corporate lobby. The lead officer cleared his throat loudly, drawing his weapon and ordering them both to freeze. Megan spun around, the remaining color draining from her face as she realized she was surrounded by law enforcement. 2 officers immediately moved forward, grabbing her arms and forcing her roughly against the hood of her wrecked silver sedan. They secured heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists, officially placing her under arrest for attempted commercial arson and grand embezzlement. Megan began thrashing wildly against the officers, shedding her arrogant socialite persona entirely as she shrieked that Jordan was the mastermind who forced her into the warehouse smuggling operation against her will. Seeing his wife actively throwing him to the wolves to save herself, Jordan dropped to his knees right in the puddle of raw gasoline. He raised his hands in the air, sobbing hysterically and begging the officers to listen to him. He swore on his life that he was financially manipulated by Gregory and Megan, claiming he was just an innocent victim caught in their political crossfire. The police officers did not entertain a single word of his pathetic excuses. They yanked my son forcefully to his feet and locked a pair of cold steel handcuffs around his wrists as well. As the officers dragged him violently toward the back of the waiting police cruiser, Jordan dug his expensive leather shoes into the pavement and twisted his body to look back at me. Tears streamed down his face as he desperately begged me to call Bradley and use my offshore accounts to post his bail. He cried out that he was my only son and pleaded for me to save him one last time. I looked at him with absolute unwavering coldness, refusing to offer a single shred of comfort to the man who had handed me disownment papers. But before I could even formulate a response, the situation escalated into an entirely new nightmare. A sleek black government vehicle pulled sharply into the plaza, blocking the police cruisers from leaving. A sharp, incredibly severe woman wearing a dark federal suit stepped out into the chaotic lobby, flashing a shiny golden badge. She introduced herself as a federal prosecutor and held up a freshly signed federal warrant, locking her eyes directly onto mine. Before I could even process my son's pathetic plea for bail money, a sharp, authoritative voice echoed across the gasoline-soaked marble lobby. A severe woman wearing a tailored dark suit stepped through the shattered glass doors, holding a shiny gold federal badge. She introduced herself as Agent Sterling, a senior federal prosecutor. She immediately ordered the local police officers to halt their transport of the prisoners. She turned her steely gaze directly onto me and handed me a freshly printed federal warrant. Agent Sterling informed me with absolute cold precision that because the massive illegal smuggling operation and the multi-million-dollar pension embezzlement had occurred entirely under the legitimate corporate umbrella of Apex Logistics, I was officially being indicted. She stated that as the sole proprietor of the Vanguard Holding Trust, I was facing immediate federal charges for severe corporate negligence and massive international tax evasion. The local police officers stepped back respectfully as armed federal agents swarmed the lobby to secure the perimeter. I was suddenly facing the absolute destruction of my own freedom and legacy for federal crimes I had spent the entire night desperately trying to stop. The sound of my impending federal arrest was absolute music to my treacherous son's ears. From the back seat of the marked police cruiser, Jordan began to laugh with a wild, unhinged mania that chilled my blood. He pressed his face against the reinforced window, completely thrilled by the horrifying realization that if he was going down to a federal penitentiary, his father was going to burn right alongside him. He reveled in the twisted, sick satisfaction of destroying the very man who had provided him with an untouchable life. Sitting in the opposite police cruiser, Megan watched the federal agents actively surround me. A venomous, triumphant smile spread slowly across her dirt-streaked face. She had failed to burn my physical building to the ground with raw gasoline, but she firmly believed she had successfully incinerated my legal standing. Agent Sterling commanded her tactical team to begin the immediate asset seizure protocols. They prepared to lock down the entire logistics headquarters, confiscate the massive freight fleet, and permanently freeze the Vanguard Holding Trust. My corporate empire, the exact entity I had bled and sacrificed for over 40 years, was mere moments away from total federal confiscation. I stood in the ruined lobby surrounded by hostile agents, feeling the immense crushing weight of the United States government bearing down on my shoulders. I was not placed in handcuffs, but I was immediately escorted under heavy federal guard to the downtown courthouse for an emergency legal deposition. The interrogation room was sterile and freezing cold, stripped of any comfort. I sat at a long metal table while Agent Sterling marched into the room carrying a massive stack of thick financial binders. She aggressively slammed the heavy documents down directly in front of me. She opened the primary folder to reveal dozens of highly complex fraudulent corporate tax returns and illegal offshore routing manifests. Every single page bore my exact digital signature authorizing the illicit movement of millions of dollars over the past 12 months. Agent Sterling leaned over the table, demanding I confess to the systemic tax evasion and the illegal border smuggling operations. She claimed the paper trail was absolutely undeniable and that my digital authorization proved I was the master architect behind the entire criminal syndicate. She promised to recommend a lighter sentence if I surrendered my company immediately and cooperated with their ongoing racketeering investigation. I remained completely silent, refusing to take the bait or display a single ounce of fear. I simply sat back in my hard metal chair and waited for my legal counsel to take the floor. Bradley Pierce sat calmly beside me, wearing a relaxed and highly confident smile that deeply unsettled the aggressive federal prosecutor. He did not yell or argue about the validity of the printed digital signatures. Instead, he placed his worn leather briefcase onto the metal table and popped the brass latches open. Bradley reached inside and pulled out 6 heavy leather-bound accounting ledgers. These were not printed spreadsheets or digital files susceptible to remote corporate hacking. They were my personal, meticulously kept handwritten financial ledgers dating back 30 consecutive years. I had recorded every single authentic business transaction, payroll expense, and corporate tax payment in permanent black ink. Long before the era of digital banking, I had learned to trust my own pen over any computer system. I kept this tedious analog habit alive precisely to protect myself from modern corporate espionage. Bradley slid the heavy vintage books across the table toward Agent Sterling, inviting her to inspect the absolute transparent truth of my 4 decades of honest, unblemished commercial enterprise. Bradley did not stop with the handwritten ledgers. He opened a supplementary folder containing a highly detailed forensic cyber analysis conducted by my top corporate accountant, Tanya. Bradley systematically proved to the federal prosecutor that the digital signatures stamped across the fraudulent tax documents were not individually authorized. They were exact pixel-by-pixel duplicates, digitally traced and repeatedly copied from a single minor vendor contract I had physically signed over 5 years ago. He demonstrated exactly how Jordan had illegally lifted the vector file of my signature from an archived human resources server and aggressively pasted it onto the illicit tax returns to intentionally frame me. Furthermore, Bradley presented the undeniable Internet Protocol logs that Tanya had bravely extracted from Jordan's master shadow ledger during our server room rescue. The tracking data clearly showed the exact geographical location where the fraudulent tax documents were officially filed with the federal government. The IP addresses did not match my logistics headquarters or my private estate guest house. The digital footprint traced directly back to the secure private network router located inside the luxurious suburban residence of Gregory, the deeply corrupt politician, and Megan's father. The irrefutable digital evidence completely shattered the prosecutor's theory, bridging the entire embezzlement and tax evasion conspiracy directly back to the political elite. Agent Sterling meticulously reviewed the massive pile of incontrovertible forensic proof spread across the interrogation table. She was a hardened federal prosecutor but could not deny the absolute truth staring her in the face. She closed the fraudulent tax binder and formally announced she was immediately dropping all criminal charges against me. The threat of federal prison vanished instantly, but the danger to my empire was far from over. Agent Sterling warned me that although I was completely cleared of personal criminal wrongdoing, the company itself still bore the severe financial burden of the falsified filings. She revealed that the Internal Revenue Service was imposing a massive mandatory penalty fee on Apex Logistics for the severe regulatory infractions committed under Jordan's management. She handed me a formal government notice demanding an immediate payment of $2 million. I had exactly 24 hours to produce the liquid cash to settle the federal fine. If the massive penalty was not paid in full by tomorrow morning, the government would completely seize my primary warehouse and auction my logistics fleet off to the highest bidder. I returned to the quiet solitude of my guest house just as the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline. The adrenaline of the federal interrogation had finally faded, leaving me with a profound and heavy silence. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the official government notice Agent Sterling had handed me. $2 million. I had exactly 24 hours to produce the liquid cash, or the Internal Revenue Service would completely seize my primary warehouse and auction off my entire freight fleet. I had that exact amount carefully secured inside my private offshore emergency reserves. But utilizing those specific funds came with a devastating personal cost. That money was my absolute final safety net. It was the nest egg I had painstakingly built over 40 years to ensure I would never have to rely on anyone else for my care in my old age. If I wired that money to the federal government tomorrow morning, my personal retirement fund would be entirely wiped out. I would be completely starting over financially at 68 years old. I sat in the dim light, heavily contemplating the massive personal sacrifice required to fix my son's catastrophic mistakes. My eyes drifted toward the small silver-framed photograph resting on my kitchen counter. It was a picture of my late wife Miriam, taken during the very first week we officially opened our logistics company. She was standing in front of a rusted second-hand freight truck, smiling with a fierce and unwavering belief in our shared dream. I clearly remembered the exact conversation we had that day. I was terrified about taking on massive business loans, but Miriam placed her hand over my heart and told me something I never forgot. She said a true company is never just made of poured concrete and polished metal. A company is made entirely of the people who bleed for it. If you take care of the people, the business will take care of itself. Her words echoed perfectly in the silence of the guest house. If I allowed the government to auction off the warehouse, 400 loyal mechanics drivers and administrative workers would instantly lose their livelihoods. I absolutely refused to let those hardworking families suffer because of my son's boundless greed. I made the final definitive choice. I decided to completely liquidate my entire private retirement reserve to save the company and protect the people who had loyally stood by me for decades. The very next morning, I walked directly into the main branch of my downtown commercial bank the second their heavy glass doors unlocked. I sat across from the senior branch manager and formally authorized the immediate liquidation of my private offshore safety net. I signed the extensive transfer documents without a single moment of hesitation. The massive wire transfer was routed straight to the federal accounts of the Internal Revenue Service, completely clearing the $2 million penalty fee well before the 24-hour deadline expired. I received the official stamped federal receipt confirming the debt was entirely satisfied. The massive corporate crisis was officially averted. Apex Logistics was saved from federal seizure, and the Vanguard Holding Trust was completely secure. The violent storm that had threatened to destroy my 40 years of hard work had technically passed. My employees' jobs were entirely safe. I walked out of the bank with empty personal pockets but a profoundly clean conscience, ready to face the absolute final piece of this painful family tragedy. I hailed a cab and drove directly to the Fulton County Detention Center. The heavy metal doors and harsh fluorescent lights of the jail stood in stark contrast to the lavish country clubs and opulent ballrooms my son had grown so accustomed to. I was escorted into a sterile visitation room and directed to sit in a hard plastic chair facing a thick wall of reinforced smudged glass. A heavy metal door buzzed open on the opposite side of the partition. 2 armed correctional officers escorted Jordan into the tiny booth. The sight of my son struck a heavy, sorrowful chord deep within my chest. He looked utterly pathetic. He was completely stripped of his arrogant posture, his expensive watches, and his custom-tailored navy suits. Instead, he was wearing a standard oversized orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely over his defeated frame. His hair was a disheveled mess, and his face was pale shadowed by dark, heavy circles of pure exhaustion and profound fear. The powerful corporate executive who had smugly demanded my eviction in front of 90 elite guests just days ago was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, broken man facing the brutal reality of the federal justice system. Jordan picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the wall. I picked up my receiver, meeting his terrified gaze with absolute, unyielding stoicism. The moment he heard my breathing on the line, he broke down completely. He began apologizing profusely, crying genuine, ugly tears of total defeat. His voice cracked as he begged for my forgiveness, swearing that sitting in a cold jail cell had finally forced him to realize the catastrophic magnitude of his mistakes. He pleaded with me to use my vast corporate wealth to hire a high-powered elite criminal defense attorney to fight his federal charges. He desperately promised that he had changed completely overnight. He swore he would do absolutely anything to make things right, offering to work for free in the warehouse, to publicly apologize to the entire staff, to do whatever it took to earn back a fraction of my trust. He frantically grabbed the glass partition with his chained hands. I desperately tried to convince me that if I just bought his freedom this one last time, he would become the loyal, respectful son I had always wanted. He was aggressively bargaining for his life, hoping my paternal instincts would override the sheer devastation he had caused. I let him finish his frantic, tearful bargaining. I did not offer a comforting smile or a promise of financial rescue. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single, neatly typed legal document. I pressed the paper firmly against the reinforced glass so he could read the bold print clearly. I told him this was a finalized plea deal that Bradley had actively negotiated directly with Agent Sterling. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. Jordan had to officially plead guilty to the embezzlement charges, agree to serve exactly 5 years in a minimum security facility, and sign a full confession implicating Megan and Gregory in the conspiracy. I told him plainly that if he refused to sign this exact document today, Bradley would withdraw his protection, and Jordan would face a merciless trial resulting in a guaranteed 20-year sentence. The choice was entirely his. He could finally take real accountability for his actions, or he could lose the rest of his life. Jordan stared at the paper, realizing he had to make the ultimate choice. Jordan stared at the single sheet of typed paper resting against the thick, reinforced glass partition separating us. I could see the intense, frantic battle raging behind his bloodshot eyes. His deeply ingrained arrogance was violently colliding with his raw survival instinct. For a brief moment, the slick corporate vice president tried to resurface to salvage his pride. He leaned closer to the glass and attempted to leverage our shared bloodline to negotiate better terms. He begged me to talk to Bradley and secure a lighter sentence, suggesting maybe 2 years in a white-collar facility instead of the mandatory 5 in a minimum security camp. He promised that if I just gave him a little more leniency, he could slowly rebuild his reputation and help me run the logistics company from behind the scenes when he got out. I did not entertain a single syllable of his delusional bargaining. I simply placed my hands flat on my knees and stood up from the hard plastic chair. I buttoned my tweed jacket, making it absolutely clear that my patience was entirely exhausted and I was prepared to walk out of that visitation room without looking back. I showed him zero compromise. The absolute terror of spending 20 years in a harsh federal penitentiary finally broke through his stubborn delusion. As I turned my back to the glass, Jordan panicked completely. He slammed his chained hands against the partition and screamed for me to wait, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. The correctional officers standing in the corner of the room immediately tensed, but Jordan ignored them and frantically grabbed the cheap plastic pen resting on his side of the metal counter. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold the pen straight against the paper. Tears streamed down his face as he hastily scribbled his signature across the bottom line of the finalized plea deal. By signing that specific document, he officially admitted to every single count of federal embezzlement, corporate fraud, and illegal smuggling. More importantly, that signature acted as a lethal legal weapon that permanently sealed the fate of his co-conspirators. He had just formally implicated Megan and Gregory in the entire criminal enterprise, providing the federal prosecutors with the exact sworn testimony they needed to bury the corrupt politician and the greedy socialite for the rest of their natural lives. Jordan surrendered his freedom to save himself from absolute annihilation. A stern guard stepped forward and slid the signed legal document through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. I picked up the paper and carefully inspected the trembling ink of his signature to ensure it was completely legible and legally binding before neatly folding it into the inner pocket of my jacket. I did not offer my son a loving smile or a final word of paternal comfort to ease his troubled conscience. I leaned close to the thick glass and looked directly into his red, swollen eyes. I told him plainly that when he eventually served his 5 years and walked out of those heavy prison gates, he would never set foot inside a corporate boardroom ever again. I made it unequivocally clear that his days of wearing tailored suits and playing logistics executive were permanently over. He had maliciously shattered the trust of the working-class families who built our massive wealth, and he would spend the rest of his life earning back his dignity the hard way. I turned around and walked deliberately down the sterile gray corridors of the county detention center, leaving my weeping son behind the heavy steel doors. When I pushed through the main security exit and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, I finally took a deep, unobstructed breath of clean air. The brutal legal battles were officially won. The immense corporate empire I built from a single rusted truck was completely safe from federal seizure and political corruption. Gregory and Megan, the untouchable socialites who believed they could steal the life savings of honest workers without facing a single consequence, had been entirely dismantled by their own boundless hubris. Their insatiable greed completely blinded them to the reality that a man who spent 40 years navigating frozen highways and hostile loading docks would never surrender his hard-earned legacy without a catastrophic fight. They assumed my quiet nature meant I was weak and defenseless, easily brushed aside for their convenience. They learned too late that silence is simply the sound of a meticulous strategist preparing an inescapable trap to completely neutralize his enemies. I walked toward my waiting vehicle, knowing that the toxic elements trying to infect my life were now securely locked away where they could no longer harm my people. I hailed a cab outside the jail and directed the driver to take me straight back to the sprawling suburban estate where this entire ordeal had begun. When I arrived at the grand iron gates, the massive yellow bulldozers and heavy demolition equipment Jordan had gleefully hired just a week ago were already idling loudly in the pristine driveway. The bewildered site foreman approached me with a clipboard asking if he should proceed with tearing down my modest guest house to make room for the new luxury pool Megan had demanded. I took his clipboard, crossed out the original architectural blueprints with a heavy black marker, and handed it back to him. I ordered the demolition crew to completely ignore the guest house where I intended to stay. Instead, I instructed them to redirect their heavy machinery and tear the massive, ostentatious main mansion completely to the ground. The foreman stared at me in absolute shock, verifying the property deeds I provided to ensure I had the legal authority to authorize such a monumental destruction. I confirmed I owned every single brick of the property free and clear and ordered him to start the roaring diesel engines immediately. The wealthy, judgmental neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns, watching in absolute shock as the massive steel excavators violently tore into the towering pillars of the grand estate. The extravagant mansion that Megan had aggressively used to assert her fake dominance over the local socialites was rapidly reduced to a massive pile of shattered marble and splintered wood. I stood on the pristine driveway, watching the dust rise high into the warm Georgia sky. I did not need a sprawling, empty mansion to validate my worth. I planned to sell the freshly cleared, highly valuable acreage to a commercial developer and take the multi-million-dollar profit to establish a permanent college trust fund. I was going to use the absolute ruins of their arrogant lifestyle to completely pay for the university tuitions of every single child belonging to my dedicated warehouse employees. It was the ultimate poetic redistribution of wealth, ensuring the families who truly built the Vanguard Empire would be the ones who rightfully inherited its greatest rewards. The turbulent months following the federal trial gradually gave way to a quiet, steady rhythm of peace. The sprawling, ostentatious mansion that once dominated the property was completely gone, meticulously dismantled down to its very foundation. In its place, I had commissioned a beautiful, expansive community park. Lush green lawns, towering oak trees, and a modern playground now occupied the space where Megan had once hosted her elitist, sneering socialite gatherings. The children of my warehouse mechanics and freight drivers now spent their weekends running across the very same grass that had previously been restricted behind heavy iron gates. I remained perfectly content living in the modest, single-story guest house exactly where I had started. I did not need massive crystal chandeliers or vaulted ceilings to validate my existence. My small kitchen, my comfortable worn armchair, and the absolute silence of a life free from manipulation were the only luxuries I required. Waking up every morning without the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest felt like breathing clean air for the first time in a decade. When I finally returned to the towering glass headquarters of Apex Logistics to formally resume my public duties, I did not wear a custom-tailored navy suit. I left the expensive silk ties and imported leather shoes locked away in my closet. Instead, I put on my old, faded brown canvas work jacket and my scuffed steel-toed boots. I wanted to walk back into my building looking exactly like the man who had built it from a single rusted truck. The moment the elevator doors slid open onto the primary warehouse operations floor, a sudden, deafening roar of applause erupted through the massive facility. 400 drivers, mechanics, and administrative workers had paused their shifts, lining the loading docks to welcome me back. These were the men and women whose entire life savings I had rescued from federal seizure. They clapped, whistled, and pounded their heavy tools against the shipping crates in a thunderous display of absolute, unwavering loyalty. Several veteran drivers stepped forward to shake my hand, their eyes shining with profound gratitude. I looked out over the sea of faces, recognizing the people who truly represented the beating heart of the Vanguard Holding Trust. I had saved their pensions, but their dedication had ultimately saved my legacy. I immediately set about completely restructuring the executive hierarchy, actively purging every remaining trace of the toxic corporate culture my son had fostered. I called Tanya into the boardroom. The brave young accountant who had risked her life hiding in a gas-filled server room to secure the master ledger was officially promoted to chief financial officer. She possessed the fierce integrity and brilliant mind required to protect our assets permanently. Next, I brought Rufus up from the loading docks. The loyal veteran trucker who had smuggled me out of a police manhunt in his sleeper cab was appointed as the new head of logistics. He knew the supply chain and the freight routes better than any highly paid corporate consultant ever could. I systematically placed the entire operational control of the multi-million-dollar logistics empire directly into the calloused, capable hands of the people who actually built it. As I walked past the break room later that afternoon, the large television mounted on the wall was broadcasting the midday national news. The screen displayed live aerial footage of the federal courthouse downtown. The anchor announced the finalized sentencing for the massive embezzlement and racketeering conspiracy that had captivated the city. Megan and her corrupt politician father Gregory had both been officially sentenced to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The news displayed side-by-side photographs of them being escorted into a transport bus, their wrists shackled heavily in cold steel. Their meticulously crafted political empire, their offshore shell accounts, and their untouchable elitist legacy were completely and utterly destroyed. They had arrogantly believed they could rob honest working-class families and simply brush away the consequences using their immense privilege. Instead, their boundless hubris had orchestrated their absolute financial and social annihilation. They were stripped of their expensive tailored clothing, their luxury cars, and their unearned power, leaving them to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of a tiny concrete prison cell for the next decade and a half. I stepped into the spacious corner executive office and took a seat behind the heavy oak desk. I opened my thick, leather-bound, handwritten financial ledgers, running my fingers over the precise black ink recording our massive quarterly profits. The company was not just surviving the recent federal crisis, it was actively thriving. With Tanya expertly managing the clean, transparent corporate accounts, and Rufus driving unprecedented efficiency across the warehouse floor, our profit margins were soaring higher than they had in over 5 years. The vicious, rotting poison of entitlement and embezzlement had been completely drawn out of the Vanguard Holding Trust. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass window, watching my fleet of pristine freight trucks rolling steadily out of the loading gates onto the interstate. A profound, unbreakable sense of peace settled deep into my spirit. The grueling shadow war was over. I had successfully protected my late wife's vision, secured the livelihoods of 400 dedicated families, and firmly defended my own dignity against those who sought to erase me. I had restored the proper order to my universe. A full 5 years leaped forward, bringing a season of quiet prosperity and healing. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday morning in early November. I was standing under the corrugated metal awning of the primary loading dock, nursing a steaming mug of bitter black coffee while watching the early shift secure their freight loads. The steady rhythm of the heavy rain hitting the pavement was suddenly interrupted by the loud, grinding air brakes of a commercial Greyhound bus pulling up to the main security gates. The folding doors hissed open, and a solitary figure stepped out onto the wet asphalt. He carried no luggage, only a thin plastic bag holding his personal effects. The man was dressed in cheap, ill-fitting clothes that hung loosely on a frail, exhausted frame. As he slowly lifted his head and turned his face toward the warehouse lights, my heart gave a sudden, heavy jolt. It was Jordan, newly paroled and standing in the pouring rain, returning to the very empire he had once tried to steal. Jordan walked slowly across the damp asphalt of the loading yard. The relentless morning rain soaked completely through his cheap gray sweatshirt and ill-fitting denim jeans. He moved with a heavy, labored shuffle that belonged to a much older man, entirely stripped of the fierce, entitled strut he used to parade around the corporate boardrooms. His face was deeply lined, weathered by 5 grueling years inside a minimum security federal prison camp. The sharp, arrogant corporate executive who had once shoved disownment papers into my chest was completely gone, eradicated by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the justice system. He stopped exactly 10 feet away from where I stood under the corrugated metal awning. He kept his head bowed, staring intensely at the puddles forming around his worn canvas shoes, physically unable to lift his gaze to meet mine. The silence between us stretched out, mixing with the steady drumming of the rain against the metal roof. How was a completely broken man standing before the very empire he had actively tried to destroy, waiting for a judgment he knew he absolutely deserved? "I have nowhere else to go," Jordan whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, agonizing vulnerability that I had never heard from him before. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the wet concrete as he spoke, the words tumbling out of him like a final, desperate confession. "I have absolutely no money to my name. Megan divorced me the second the federal indictment came down and severed every single tie we ever had before she went to serve her own sentence. My former business partners pretend they never knew me, and my elite social circle completely evaporated the day I put on an orange jumpsuit. I spent the last 5 years sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that every single thing I thought made me powerful was just a hollow, manufactured lie. I have absolutely nothing left. I am nothing." The absolute devastation in his voice was not a calculated manipulation or a pathetic plea to escape the consequences of his actions like it was on the day of his arrest. It was the brutal, unfiltered truth of a man who had finally hit rock bottom and scraped away all the toxic delusions that had poisoned his mind. He stood shivering in the freezing rain, completely stripped of his unearned wealth and his status, waiting for my response. I looked at my son shivering in the cold morning rain and felt a profound, complex wave of emotion wash over me. I vividly remembered the agonizing night of his promotion party inside that lavish Atlanta ballroom. I remembered the sheer cruelty in his eyes when he publicly handed me those disownment papers and ordered his armed security guards to drag me into the dark cellar. I remembered the deep, cutting pain of realizing the boy I had sacrificed my entire life to protect had transformed into a ruthless corporate predator willing to destroy innocent families for profit. But as I watched the rain drip from his bowed head, I also remembered a solemn, quiet promise I made to my late wife Miriam on her deathbed. She held my calloused hand and made me swear that no matter how far our son strayed from the righteous path, I would never completely give up on our own blood. She believed that redemption was always possible if the pride was entirely broken first. I did not step off the dry concrete dock to offer my son a warm, comforting hug. I did not invite him up to the executive suites to offer him a comfortable corner office, a tailored Navy suit, or a replenished corporate bank account. I knew that instantly restoring his privileged lifestyle would completely ruin the grueling, painful lesson he had just spent 5 years learning inside a federal prison. True redemption cannot simply be handed out freely, it must be painstakingly earned through sheer humility and actual physical labor. I turned away from him, leaving him standing in the pouring rain, and walked steadily toward the heavy metal door of the primary maintenance closet located at the far edge of the loading dock. I unlocked the door and stepped inside the dusty utility room. I bypassed the advanced electronic cleaning equipment and walked straight to the back corner. I pulled out a heavy industrial wooden-handled push broom with stiff, thick bristles. Beside it sat a pair of thick reinforced leather work gloves designed for grueling manual labor. I grabbed both items and walked back out onto the covered dock, returning to where my son was still standing quietly in the relentless storm. I stepped forward and firmly pushed the heavy wooden handle of the industrial broom directly against Jordan's chest, forcing him to raise his hands and take it. I placed the thick leather work gloves right on top of the rough wood. You will receive standard minimum wage without a single cent of corporate bonuses or specialized benefits, I told him, my voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. You will physically clock in using the punch machine at exactly 6 in the morning every single day. Your sole responsibility is to clean these loading bays, sweep the warehouse floors, and ensure the staging areas are completely clear for the freight drivers. You will not step foot inside the executive offices, and you will not offer unsolicited business advice to the current management team. Rufus is the head of logistics, and he is your direct supervisor. If you are late a single time, or if you display a fraction of disrespect toward any member of this hardworking warehouse staff, he will fire you immediately and you will never return to this property. You tried to steal this empire from the top down. Now you are going to earn your life back from the absolute bottom up, one swept floor at a time. Jordan gripped the rough wooden handle of the push broom, tightly pulling it close to his chest as if it were a literal lifeline saving him from drowning. Fresh tears immediately welled up in his tired, bloodshot eyes and began spilling rapidly down his weathered cheeks. But this time they were not the pathetic, desperate tears of a defeated narcissist trying to manipulate his way out of federal prison. They were the silent, heavy tears of pure, genuine gratitude from a broken man who realized he was finally being given a second chance at survival. He did not argue or complain about the grueling physical labor. He simply nodded his head in absolute quiet submission. Jordan slipped the thick, reinforced leather work gloves over his trembling hands, turned toward the rain-slicked concrete of the massive loading dock, and slowly began to sweep away the debris. I stood quietly under the metal awning, watching him work steadily for a long, lingering moment. Then I turned my back and walked calmly toward my office. The absolute order of the world had been perfectly and silently adjusted. True power is never found in expensive suits or massive bank accounts, but in the quiet resilience of a spirit that refuses to be broken by betrayal. When arrogance blinds those who think they are untouchable, they inevitably build the very traps that will lead to their own destruction. Protecting your peace sometimes requires tearing down the empires of those who mistreat you to clear the ground for something better. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Share your thoughts down in the comments section.